I am Zora, 35 years old, and exactly 24 hours after we buried our parents. My older brother handed me a trash bag and kicked me and my 4-year-old son out of our family estate. He told me to enjoy being homeless because he made sure I would get nothing. At the will reading days later, he was practically gloating until the family lawyer revealed my actual net worth. The number was so massive, my brother literally passed out on the boardroom floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The sharp slapping sound of a heavy black hefty bag hitting the imported Brazilian hardwood floor echoed through the upstairs hallway. I did not flinch. I just tightened my grip on the small blue asthma nebulizer in my hands, carefully wrapping the cord so it would fit into my canvas duffel bag. My 4-year-old son, Caleb, sat on the edge of the mattress, his big brown eyes wide with confusion as he watched his aunt toss his favorite wooden building blocks into the plastic sack like they were garbage. Chloe, my brother. Terrence's wife let out an exaggerated sigh as she scooped up a handful of Caleb's picture books. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out, and she was already dressed in a cream-colored silk wrap dress that seemed entirely too festive for a family that had stood beside 2 mahogany caskets just yesterday afternoon. As a white woman marrying into a prominent African-American family, Chloe had always overcompensated. She was obsessed with country club statuses and tried to forcefully navigate elite black social circles with a staggering level of condescension toward anyone she deemed less than. That included me. "I need this room cleared out in the next 20 minutes, Zora Chloe said, not even looking at me as she shoved a stuffed bear into the bag. "The caterers are setting up downstairs, and your presence here is completely ruining the aesthetic for the post-funeral brunch. We have important investors arriving soon." I placed the nebulizer into my bag and turned to face her, maintaining my composure for Caleb's sake. "We just buried my mother and father yesterday, Chloe. You are hosting a networking brunch while the flowers on their graves have not even wilted yet." "That is business," a voice drawled from the doorway. Terrence leaned against the doorframe, swirling a generous pour of scotch in a crystal tumbler. At 38, my brother was the undisputed golden child of our family. He was a smooth-talking investment banker, a prominent fraternity legacy, and a man who used our parents' towering reputation in Atlanta to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. Growing up in this $4 million estate in the Cascade area, perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. My parents had built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up. They were pillars of our church and prominent figures in the local black elite. Terrence was bred to inherit that crown, and he wore his entitlement like a tailored suit. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises," Zora Terrence announced, taking a slow sip of his drink. "And honestly, Chloe is right. Having you and the kid moping around in last season's clothes is not a good look for the partners I am bringing over today." I stood up, stepping protectively in front of Caleb. "You cannot kick us out, Terrence. This is my home too. Mom and Dad explicitly told me I could stay here while I transitioned my business." Terrence let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the high ceilings. "Your business? You mean that glorified tutoring hobby you have been wasting your life on? Please, Mom and Dad only let you stay here out of pity because you failed to secure a decent husband and ended up a struggling single mother. But they knew who the real successor was." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his tailored jacket pocket and tapped it against the doorframe. "They signed the deed of this house over to me months ago, Zora. They knew I needed the equity to cover my firm's business expansions. It is my house now, and I want you out." I stared at him, my mind racing through the sheer audacity of his claim. 10 years ago, Terrence had convinced our parents to cut off my design school tuition, telling them my ideas for an educational technology platform were a waste of their hard-earned money. I had to pack my bags back then and build my life from absolute scratch. I worked multiple jobs, poured every dime into coding and development, and built Aura Ed completely under the radar. While Terrence was out buying expensive sports cars to impress his frat brothers, I was quietly securing venture capital and building a digital empire. They all thought I was just doing freelance graphic design and barely scraping by. I let them believe it, because it kept their toxic expectations away from my son and my work. I looked at the supposed deed in his hand. Even from a distance, something about it looked off, but I knew better than to argue with a narcissist holding a glass of liquor. Terrence thrived on conflict. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg. He wanted to feel the absolute power of rendering his little sister homeless just hours after the worst loss of our lives. I turned back to the bed, scooped Caleb into my arms, and grabbed the strap of my duffel bag. "Let us go, baby," I whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We are going on a trip." Chloe stepped forward, blocking my path to the hallway. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it out to me with a pitying, deeply insulting smirk. "Here, Zora." Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Take an Uber to a motel. Try to find one in a safe neighborhood for the boys' sake. I know things are going to be really hard for you now that the handouts have stopped." I looked at the $100 bill fluttering between her manicured fingers. I looked at Terrence, who was smirking from the doorway, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my supposed humiliation. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I reached out and took the bill from her hand. Chloe's smile widened for a fraction of a second before I gripped the crisp paper with both hands and smoothly ripped it straight down the middle. I let the two torn halves flutter down, landing perfectly on the toe of her pristine beige pumps. "I do not need your pocket change, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And Terrence, you might want to ease up on the scotch. You are going to need a clear head for the reality check you are about to receive." Before either of them could formulate a response to the torn money on the floor, I walked straight past them. I carried my son down the grand sweeping staircase, walking past the catering staff, who were already setting up mimosa bars and caviar stations in the foyer. The heavy oak front doors of my childhood home stood tall and imposing. I pushed them open, stepping out into the bright, humid Atlanta morning without looking back. As I walked down the long, manicured driveway toward the street, Caleb wrapped his little arms around my neck. "Are we going home, Mommy?" he asked softly. "Yes, baby," I told him, holding him tighter. "We are going to our real home." I set my duffel bag down on the curb and pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not open a ride-sharing app to find a cheap motel. Instead, I bypassed my personal contacts and dialed a direct encrypted number. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good morning, Ms. Williams. How can I assist you today?" I looked back at the sprawling brick estate, watching Terrence's wealthy investors begin to pull their luxury vehicles through the wrought iron gates. "Morning, David," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the house. "I need you to contact our acquisitions team immediately. Initiate the hostile buyout of the commercial debt held by my brother's investment firm. Buy all of his defaulted mortgages and consolidate them under my private equity holding company. Do whatever it takes, pay whatever premium the banks are asking, but I want his entire portfolio owned by me by tomorrow morning. He just crossed the line." The doors of the presidential suite at the Four Seasons closed with a heavy, solid thud, sealing us away from the thick, humid Atlanta morning. I set my canvas duffel bag on the cool Italian marble floor and let Caleb run ahead into the sprawling living area. He immediately climbed onto the plush velvet sofa, completely unfazed by the sudden shift in our living arrangements. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the downtown skyline. The city stretched out beneath us, glittering in the early sunlight. Terrence thought he had banished me to a roach-infested motel off the interstate. He thought pulling the rug out from under a grieving single mother would finally break my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that I could buy this entire hotel building in cash if I wanted to. I sat down at the expansive glass dining table and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated a complex dashboard of climbing numbers and acquisition confirmations. My company, Aura Ed, was fully operational and thriving. 10 years ago, my brother sat in our parents' formal living room, and systematically convinced them that my acceptance into a prestigious design program was a permanent stain on the family legacy. He told them I was squandering their hard-earned money on a useless hobby while he was out building real generational wealth. They cut off my tuition the very next morning. My mother told me I needed to learn the brutal value of $1. I took that harsh lesson directly to heart. I worked 3 jobs, waited tables in Buckhead, and cleaned corporate offices at midnight just to pay for server space and coding classes. I built my educational technology platform in the absolute dark, while Terrence paraded around Morehouse alumni events flashing our parents' credit cards to buy drinks for his friends. Now, Aura Ed was a global platform utilized by school districts across the country, worth $150 million. And my private equity holding company was currently finalizing the purchase of every single defaulted commercial loan my brother had hidden from the family. I watched the progress bar on my screen reach 95%. He had been secretly bleeding the family business dry to pay for Chloe's exorbitant country club memberships and luxury cars. Now I was about to own every single drop of his debt. My phone buzzed violently against the glass table, breaking my intense concentration. I glanced at the glowing screen. 57 unread messages, 14 missed calls. Almost all of them were from Aunt Vivian. I tapped the screen and pressed play on the most recent voicemail, letting her voice fill the massive, quiet suite. "Zora, you need to call me back right this instant." Aunt Vivian's voice trembled with a mixture of practiced church lady concern and absolute venom. "Terrence just told us what you did. How could you have a mental breakdown right after we put your parents in the ground? Chloe is in tears right now. She said you grabbed Caleb screaming like a madwoman and stole the antique family silver before running out the door. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family and to your parents' pristine legacy. Our pastor is praying for your soul this morning because we all know you desperately need it." I stopped the audio playback. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking but entirely predictable. Terrence and Chloe had wasted no time spinning a malicious narrative to protect their fragile image. In our elite African-American circles in Atlanta, reputation was currency. Aunt Vivian was the premier gossip of our massive congregation, holding court every single Sunday in her custom hats and tailored suits. By feeding her this wild story, Terrence knew she would broadcast my supposed insanity to every prominent family in the city before lunchtime. He wanted me ostracized. He wanted me completely cut off from any potential support system, so I would be forced to come crawling back to him on my knees begging for a handout. I calmly deleted the voicemail. I did not text her back to defend myself or explain the truth. Explanations were for people who lacked leverage, and I held all the cards. I closed my laptop and walked into the master bedroom to get Caleb ready for his day. He was bouncing on the massive king-sized bed, giggling as the morning sun warmed the room. I dressed him in his crisp navy blazer and khaki trousers, smoothing down his curly hair. We were not going to hide in this hotel suite like terrified victims. We were going to step out into the light and proceed exactly as I had planned. I pulled on a tailored emerald green sheath dress, fastened a pair of understated diamond stud earrings, and ordered a luxury black car service. When we stepped out of the hotel lobby, a sleek black Escalade was waiting at the curb, with the driver standing at attention, holding the heavy door open. We slid into the pristine leather seats, and I gave the driver the address for the Sinclair Academy. The Sinclair Academy was the most exclusive private preschool in the entire state of Georgia. Getting a child enrolled there required much more than just vast amounts of wealth. It required pedigree, deep community influence, and navigating a waitlist that spanned several years. Chloe had been desperately trying to get her daughter into Sinclair since the exact day she found out she was pregnant. As a white woman trying to force her way into the upper echelons of Atlanta's elite black society, she believed securing a spot at Sinclair would finally validate her status and prove she belonged. She had attended every open house, sent endless gifts to the staff, and relentlessly bothered the administration. I walked Caleb up the pristine stone pathway toward the main administrative building. The heavy glass doors slid open, revealing a reception area that looked much more like a high-end modern art gallery than a preschool for toddlers. And right there, standing at the reception desk in her beige pumps, was Chloe. She was leaning over the desk, aggressively waving a glossy folder at the admissions director, Mrs. Davenport. "I do not think you understand exactly who my husband is," Chloe insisted, her voice shrill and demanding, echoing unpleasantly in the quiet lobby. "Terrence is a highly prominent investment banker. We are heavily involved in the community. I know there must be a spot left for our daughter. We are willing to pay double the tuition right now in cash if necessary." Mrs. Davenport, a striking woman with elegant silver hair and impeccable posture, maintained a polite but visibly frosty expression. "As I have explained 3 times already this morning, our classes are entirely full. We do not make exceptions based on financial offers. We prioritize families who contribute significantly to the structural development of our institution and who reflect our core community values." Chloe crossed her arms, huffing in loud frustration. "Well, who exactly is contributing more than us?" Before Mrs. Davenport could formulate a response, her eyes shifted past Chloe's shoulder and landed directly on me. The frosty professional mask she wore instantly melted into an expression of profound warmth and genuine reverence. She stepped out from behind the heavy mahogany desk, completely ignoring Chloe's presence, and walked briskly across the lobby toward us. "Ms. Williams, what an absolute honor to have you back on campus." Mrs. Davenport beamed, extending both hands to greet me warmly. "And Caleb, look how tall you are getting. We have everything prepared for him in the advanced robotics playroom, just as you requested." I smiled warmly, shaking her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Davenport. I appreciate you making the accommodations so quickly on such short notice." "It is the absolute least we could do," Mrs. Davenport replied, her tone practically glowing with respect. "Your foundation's recent generous endowment for our new digital arts wing has completely transformed our curriculum. The board of directors is still very much hoping you will join us as a leading trustee next semester. We would be incredibly fortunate to have your guidance." Chloe stood completely frozen at the reception desk. Her jaw hung slack and her eyes darted between me and the admissions director in sheer, unadulterated shock. She looked at my expensive designer dress. She looked out the glass doors at the luxury car and private driver, waiting patiently at the curb. And she watched the way the most powerful and gatekeeping educator in the city was treating me like absolute royalty. The carefully constructed lie she had just fed to the entire church congregation about me being a homeless, crazy woman shattered in real time right before her eyes. I left Chloe standing in the polished marble lobby of the preschool, her mouth hanging completely open in sheer disbelief. I did not stay to watch her attempt to process how the struggling sister-in-law she had just tried to evict with a single crumpled bill was suddenly the academy's most revered benefactor. I simply nodded to the admissions director, turned on my heel, and walked back out the heavy glass doors. My son was safe and happily engaged in his advanced robotics class. Now it was time for me to secure the next piece of the puzzle. I slid into the quiet leather interior of the waiting town car and gave my driver the address for the Piedmont Heights Country Club. The Piedmont Heights Country Club was the undisputed crown jewel of elite Atlanta society. It was a sprawling, heavily gated sanctuary of emerald golf courses, towering oak trees, and hushed conversations over top-shelf bourbon. My parents had been legacy members there for over 30 years. They had hosted charity galas, negotiated massive commercial real estate deals, and celebrated anniversaries within those pristine walls. My father also kept a private executive locker there, which held a specific safety deposit key. He had entrusted the master access code solely to me months ago, during a quiet conversation when his health first began to rapidly fail. He knew Terrence was dangerously reckless with money, but he did not know the full catastrophic extent of the financial rot. He just wanted to make sure I had a secure backup plan tucked away where my brother could never reach it. The heavy mahogany doors of the clubhouse were opened for me by a uniformed attendant who greeted me with a polite bow. I stepped into the grand lobby. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and lemon oil polish. The space was filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy patrons enjoying their morning tea. I walked across the plush Persian rugs, making a direct line for the concierge desk to retrieve my father's belongings. "Zora, what on earth are you doing here?" The sharp, grating voice echoed across the quiet lobby, slicing through the refined atmosphere like a jagged knife. I stopped and took a slow, calming breath before turning around. Marching toward me with a look of aggressive disapproval was my Aunt Vivian. She was flanked by 3 of her closest friends, all of whom were prominent fixtures in our church congregation and the local high society circuit. Aunt Vivian was dressed in a pristine lavender suit, holding a designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She was my late parent's sister, but she had always operated as Terrence's ultimate enabler. In Vivian's eyes, my brother was a flawless king who could do no wrong, while I was the perpetual disappointment who had stubbornly refused to marry a doctor or a lawyer. "I am simply taking care of some family business, Aunt Vivian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and pleasant. "I hope you are having a good morning." Vivian stopped a few feet away from me, planting her hands on her hips. Her 3 friends hovered closely behind her, their eyes wide with eager anticipation for the drama they were about to witness. Terrence and Chloe had clearly already done their work spinning the narrative of my eviction. "Family business," she scoffed loudly, deliberately raising her voice so the surrounding club members would turn their heads to watch us. "Terrence called me this morning practically in tears. He told me you completely lost your mind at the estate. He had to ask you to leave the house because you were acting completely unhinged, taking things that did not belong to you. And now you are showing up here at the club looking for what exactly? A free meal." I looked at her friends who were whispering behind their manicured hands. Aunt Vivian thrived on this exact type of public humiliation. She loved positioning herself as the generous matriarch while tearing others down. "I am here to retrieve my father's safety deposit key from his locker," I explained calmly, refusing to take her bait. "It belongs to me." Aunt Vivian let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "That key belongs to Terrence. He is the rightful head of this family now, and he is the one handling your parents' estate. You need to hand over whatever access codes you have to him immediately before you cause any more damage. You have always been so selfish, Zora. Your brother is grieving and trying to hold the family business together while you are out here playing games." She took a step closer, dramatically unzipping her designer handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick leather wallet. Her friends leaned in closer, watching her performative display of pity. "Terrence told me you and the boy are entirely homeless now," Vivian continued, her loud voice echoing off the marble pillars. "I know you do not have any real income with that little computer hobby of yours. I am not going to let my own flesh and blood starve on the street, even if you have completely disgraced your parents' memory." She pulled 5 $20 bills from her wallet and held them out toward me, her chin raised in a gesture of extreme condescension. "Here, Zora, take this and go buy some groceries for Caleb. Please just take the money and leave the club before you embarrass us any further." The 3 society ladies behind her let out soft, sympathetic sighs, shaking their heads at my supposed destitution. They were waiting for me to lower my eyes, take the cash, and slink away in absolute shame. They expected me to crumble under the weight of Aunt Vivian's public execution. I did not break eye contact. I did not reach for the money. Instead, I stood completely still, letting a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. I looked directly into Vivian's eyes and watched the smug confidence falter just a fraction of an inch as she realized I was not displaying the appropriate level of fear. "Keep your cash." "Aunt Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational volume that forced her friends to lean in closer just to hear me. "You are going to need every single dollar of it to pay off Uncle Marcus's bookie." Aunt Vivian froze. The outstretched hand holding the bills began to visibly tremble. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her loud church voice instantly vanishing. "I am talking about the $45,000 Uncle Marcus lost at the underground poker tables last month," I said, keeping my tone bright and conversational. "I am also talking about the $200,000 he lost betting on college football over the winter. But mostly, Aunt Vivian, I am talking about the massive secret loans you have been begging Terrence to give you from my parents' company accounts just to keep the loan sharks from showing up at your front door. The three society ladies standing behind her gasped collectively, stepping back as if Vivian had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. In their world, gambling debts and loan sharks were the ultimate unpardonable sins. A scandal of that magnitude would permanently ruin her standing in the church and the community. Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe through the sheer panic of being exposed. "You see, Vivian?" I continued, stepping slightly closer to her. "You thought Terrence was being generous when he quietly transferred those company funds to you. You thought your secret was perfectly safe. But Terrence is sloppy. He leaves a paper trail everywhere he goes. I know exactly how much money he stole from my parents to cover up your husband's gambling addiction. I know all the account numbers and I know all the dates. So do not ever stand in a public lobby and try to humiliate me with grocery money again. Your pristine image is hanging by a single thread and I am the one holding the scissors." I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I turned away from the group, leaving Aunt Vivian utterly silenced and trembling in the center of the lobby, while her friends stared at her in horrified disbelief. I walked smoothly to the concierge desk, provided the necessary identification and master code, and retrieved the heavy brass safety deposit key from the manager. As I walked back out through the grand mahogany doors toward the waiting black car, my phone vibrated intensely in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Terrence. I just froze the childhood joint accounts. "Good luck buying food for Caleb. Boardroom. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. Do not be late." I slid into the back seat of the car, closing the door with a satisfying thud. Terrence actually believed that cutting off a dusty savings account had financially crippled me. He had absolutely no idea that I was arriving tomorrow to dismantle his entire existence. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as the heavy black SUV pulled away from the country club. A genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest, filling the quiet leather interior of the vehicle. Terrence had actually frozen the joint savings account our parents had set up for us when we were in high school. There was barely $12,000 in that account. He honestly believed that cutting off access to that dusty old account was the ultimate checkmate. He thought he was severing my only lifeline, leaving me stranded on the streets of Atlanta with a hungry child. It was almost sad how small his imagination truly was. I swiped away his text message and dialed Marcus. Marcus was the chief financial officer of Aura Ed and the brilliant architect behind my private equity holding company. The line did not even ring a full time before he answered. "Good morning, Zora Marcus," said his voice carrying the crisp hum of a busy corporate office in the background. "I was just about to call you. The acquisition is complete. The ink is drying as we speak." I leaned back against the plush headrest, watching the manicured lawns of Buckhead blur past my window. "Tell me exactly what we bought, Marcus. I want to hear the full extent of my brother's brilliant business acumen." Marcus let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It is worse than we originally projected, Zora. Your brother has been systematically bleeding your parents' commercial real estate company dry for the better part of 5 years. He set up a web of dummy corporate entities disguised as property management vendors. He would approve massive invoices for renovations on your parents' buildings, but no work was ever actually done. The money was routed directly into his personal offshore accounts." I closed my eyes, feeling a sharp, familiar sting of anger. My parents had worked their entire lives to build their company. They sacrificed skipped vacations and poured their blood and sweat into every single brick of those commercial properties. And Terrence had hollowed it all out from the inside, leaving them with nothing but a facade. "Where did the money go, Marcus?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Everywhere," Marcus replied. "Country club initiation fees, a $300,000 deposit on a vacation home in Aspen that he ended up defaulting on, a fleet of luxury vehicles leased under the company name. He even funneled $500,000 into a vanity interior design business registered to a Chloe Williams, a business that, according to federal tax records, has never had a single paying client. He bled your parents dry to fund an illusion of extreme wealth. My grip on the phone tightened. Chloe had stood in my parents' home yesterday, wearing clothes paid for by my parents' stolen money, and handed me a ripped $100 bill like she was doing me a massive favor. And the commercial mortgages, I asked. Defaulted, Marcus confirmed. When he ran out of cash to steal, he started heavily leveraging your parents' prime real estate. He took out massive high-interest loans against the properties using his power of attorney. He missed the last 4 payments. The bank was quietly preparing to seize everything by the end of this month. But since we swooped in and bought the debt at a premium, your holding company now owns all $15 million of his defaulted paper. You own the debt, Zora. You own him. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of my absolute leverage wash over me. Thank you, Marcus. Have the legal team prepare the executive dossiers for tomorrow morning. I want every single fraudulent wire transfer, every defaulted loan, and every stolen dollar highlighted and ready to project on a screen. I ended the call just as my driver smoothly merged onto Peachtree Road. The feeling of absolute power was intoxicating, but my moment of satisfaction was immediately interrupted. My phone began to vibrate again. This time the caller ID flashed with Chloe's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. Zora? Sweetie? Chloe's voice drifted through the speaker, practically dripping with artificial sugar and fake sympathy. I am so glad you picked up. I have been just sick with worry all morning. I am doing perfectly fine. Chloe, I said, keeping my tone completely neutral. What do you want? Chloe let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world on her shoulders. Listen, things got a little too heated yesterday at the house. Terrence is just grieving. We all are. And I know he sent you a text about freezing the childhood bank accounts. He is just trying to secure the estate while we figure out the massive mess your parents left behind. But I cannot stop thinking about little Caleb. I am a mother too, Zora. I know how terrified you must be right now with no money and nowhere to go. I stayed silent, letting her dig her own grave. So, I talked to Terrence. Chloe continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. And I convinced him to offer you a compromise. We have a beautiful pool house in the backyard of the estate. The previous owners used it as a guest suite. It has a small kitchenette and a functioning bathroom. We are willing to let you and Caleb stay in the pool house rent-free for the next 2 months so you can get back on your feet and figure out your little tutoring business. How incredibly generous of you, I said, masking the absolute disgust in my throat. Living in the backyard of the house I grew up in. What is the catch, Chloe? Chloe hesitated, her fake sweetness faltering for just a fraction of a second. There is no catch, Zora. We just need to make sure the family business transitions smoothly tomorrow morning. The lawyers are going to be at the boardroom. Terrence needs absolute control to manage the debts and protect the family name. We just need you to sign a simple document waiving your rights as the secondary executor of the estate before the meeting begins. It is just a formality, really. But if you sign it, the pool house is yours. The sheer audacity of her proposal was almost beautiful. They were terrified. Terrence knew he had destroyed the company finances, and he knew that if I stepped into the boardroom tomorrow as an executor with legal standing to demand a forensic audit, his entire house of cards would instantly collapse. He was trying to buy my silence and my legal rights with a tiny, unheated pool house and a fake olive branch. I am going to have to pass on the pool house, Chloe, I said, leaning forward to look out the window as my car pulled up to my destination. I prefer my current accommodations. The mask instantly slipped. Chloe's tone turned incredibly nasty, losing all of its southern hospitality charm. You are so stupid and stubborn, Zora, she spat. You cannot live in a Motel 6 forever. You have absolutely $0 to your name and 0 prospects. Terrence is offering you a roof over your child's head, and you are throwing it back in our faces out of pure spite. If you walk into that boardroom tomorrow without signing that waiver, Terrence is going to make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing. You will be ruined. My driver opened the door of the car, letting the warm morning air flood into the back seat. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement, looking up at the elegant frosted glass doors of the most exclusive bespoke tailoring boutique in Atlanta. Through the window, I could see the master tailor already waiting for me, holding a measuring tape and a glass of champagne. "I will see you tomorrow at 9. "Chloe," I said, a cold, genuine smile spreading across my face. "Do not be late." I ended the call and slipped the phone into my purse. I walked through the glass doors of the boutique, breathing in the rich scent of imported Italian fabrics and expensive cologne. Tomorrow morning, I was walking into the lion's den to reclaim my family's legacy, and I was going to do it wearing a $5,000 bespoke suit. The morning sun struck the towering glass facade of the Williams Tower, casting a brilliant golden reflection across the busy downtown Atlanta street. I stood on the pavement for a brief moment, looking up at the 15-story monument my parents had built from absolute scratch. 20 years ago, this entire city block was nothing but an abandoned dirt lot and a chain-link fence. My father and mother had poured their blood, sweat, and every single dime they possessed into breaking ground on this property. They turned a modest neighborhood contracting firm into a formidable commercial real estate empire. Now my brother was sitting somewhere up on the top floor, treating their life's work like his own personal casino. I adjusted the lapels of my emerald green bespoke suit. The Italian wool and silk blend hugged my shoulders like armor, moving with a flawless, fluid grace that only a $5,000 price tag could guarantee. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling an absolute icy calm settle over my mind. Today was the day the house of cards came crashing down. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. The morning rush of executives and assistants buzzed around me, but my focus was entirely fixed on the bank of private elevators at the far end of the atrium. Before I could reach them, a sharp voice called out from the main reception desk. "Zora, wait, you cannot just walk back there." I paused and turned my head. Brenda, the senior receptionist, was half standing behind her massive curved desk, waving a manicured hand at me. Terrence had hired Brenda 3 years ago specifically because she possessed the exact type of shallow gatekeeping arrogance he valued in his corporate staff. She had spent the last 3 years looking down her nose at me whenever I visited the building, treating me like a bothersome vendor rather than the daughter of the founders. She had always made a point to make me wait in the lobby for at least 20 minutes before announcing my arrival to my brother. "I am going up to the executive suite, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly steady, without breaking my stride. Brenda scrambled out from behind her desk, her cheap, sensible heels clicking frantically against the marble floor as she tried to intercept me. "You are not on the approved visitor schedule this morning, Zora." Terrence gave me strict instructions. "He is leading a highly confidential closed-door meeting with the executive board and the estate attorneys. I cannot let you up there. If you just take a seat in the waiting area, I can check his calendar for a brief window this afternoon." I stopped walking and turned to face her fully. I looked her up and down, taking in her panicked expression and the way she was physically trying to block my path to the elevators. "I am not a visitor, Brenda," I said, speaking slowly and deliberately, so the words would fully penetrate her mind. "I am a primary stakeholder in this company and the secondary executor of my parents' estate. I do not require a calendar invitation to access a building that has my last name bolted to the front of it in 10-foot steel letters." Brenda swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the 2 security guards standing near the front entrance. "Terrence said he would terminate my employment immediately if I let you interrupt this meeting, Zora. Please do not make me call security to have you escorted out." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "Brenda, if you feel the need to call security, by all means pick up the phone. But I strongly advise you to start packing up your desk, because by the time this meeting is over, Terrence is not going to have the authority to fire a single person in this entire building." I did not wait to see if she would actually signal the guards. I turned my back on her, pressed the call button for the private executive elevator, and stepped inside the moment the brushed steel doors slid open. As the elevator ascended rapidly to the 15th floor, the quiet hum of the machinery felt like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to my brother's destruction. I watched the floor numbers light up on the digital display, preparing myself for the absolute circus I was about to walk into. The elevator doors chimed and opened directly into the plush, quiet reception area of the executive suite. I bypassed the empty assistant desks and walked straight down the thickly carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. The heavy double doors were made of solid oak carved with the company crest. I did not bother to knock. I placed both hands flat against the polished wood and pushed the doors wide open. The conversation inside the room stopped instantly. The executive boardroom was a vast, imposing space featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Running down the center of the room was a massive mahogany conference table surrounded by black leather chairs. Sitting at the absolute head of the table, occupying the exact chair my father had commanded for 2 decades, was Terrence. He was leaning back with his hands steeply resting against his chin, wearing a charcoal designer suit and an expression of supreme, unearned authority. Seated immediately to his right was Chloe. She was wearing a high-necked black morning dress, playing the role of the grieving but endlessly supportive wife to absolute perfection. She had a pristine white tissue clutched in her hand, dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes, as if she had just been weeping over the tragedy of my parents' passing. And sitting 2 chairs down from Chloe, looking like a terrified thundercloud, was Aunt Vivian. She was gripping her coffee cup so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. When the doors crashed open, she flinched visibly. Her eyes darted toward me, and then immediately dropped down to the polished surface of the table, completely unable to meet my gaze. The absolute public humiliation I had handed her at the country club yesterday was clearly still burning fresh in her mind, but she had dragged herself here anyway, clinging to Terrence's perceived power for protection. "Well, look who finally decided to join the adults in the room," Terrence said, his voice dripping with heavy, practiced sarcasm. He did not bother to stand up. He simply leaned further back in my father's chair, swiveling slightly from side to side. "We were beginning to think you had completely lost your grip on reality and skipped town." I stepped fully into the boardroom, letting the heavy oak doors click shut behind me. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, confident sound of my heels striking the hardwood floor as I walked slowly toward the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I did not sit down immediately. I stood behind the empty leather chair at the far end, folding my hands perfectly in front of me and projecting an aura of total impenetrable calm. "I would not miss this meeting for the world, Terrence," I said, my voice smooth and pleasant. "I understand we have some vital family business to officially conclude today." Terrence let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked me up and down, his eyes raking over the impeccable tailoring of my emerald green suit. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head in manufactured pity. "I see you dressed up for the occasion, Zora. Let me guess. Did you max out your very last credit card to rent that outfit? Or did you hit up a luxury consignment shop, hoping to look like a real executive for once in your life? You always were obsessed with playing dress-up, while I was the one doing the actual heavy lifting for this family." Chloe chimed in immediately, her voice coated in a thick layer of sickeningly fake sympathy. "We are just so incredibly worried about your mental state, Zora. Showing up here wearing expensive designer clothes when you do not even have a proper roof over your child's head. It is just terribly sad. I offered you the pool house yesterday out of the goodness of my heart, and you threw it back in my face. You are acting completely irrational." Aunt Vivian muttered something under her breath about disrespecting the family name, but she kept her eyes glued to her coffee cup, too terrified of what I might expose to actually speak up and attack me directly. I kept my expression perfectly serene, completely absorbing their insults without a single flinch. They were following a very predictable script. Terrence needed to paint me as an unstable, financially ruined dependent, so he could justify entirely cutting me out of the company infrastructure. He needed to establish complete dominance in this room before the estate attorneys arrived to finalize the legal transition of power. He thought he was backing a terrified, helpless animal into a corner. He had no idea he had just locked himself inside a cage with a predator. "My mental state is perfectly fine, Chloe," I replied, offering her a razor-sharp smile that made her subtly shift backward in her chair. "And my wardrobe is entirely paid for in cash. But I do appreciate your deep concern for my financial well-being. It is so incredibly thoughtful of you to worry about my money when you have so many expensive country club memberships to maintain." Chloe's jaw snapped shut. her eyes narrowing in sudden anger at the subtle mention of the country club. Terence slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, loudly cutting off the verbal sparring. He leaned forward, dropping the arrogant smirk and replacing it with a look of cold, aggressive hostility. "Enough of the games!" Zora Terence demanded, his voice echoing sharply off the glass windows. "We do not have time for your usual dramatic theatrics today. The estate attorneys will be here in exactly 15 minutes, and I need to have this situation completely neutralized before they sit down at this table. Our parents left this company in a highly delicate transitional phase. We have creditors breathing down our necks and massive corporate accounts that need to be stabilized. I cannot have an emotional, unpredictable liability like you hovering around the edges of my business, demanding handouts and causing disruptions." He reached down into his leather briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a thick-bound legal document. It was easily 50 pages long, secured with heavy brass clips. He tossed it casually across the long expanse of the polished mahogany table. The heavy document slid across the slick wood and came to a stop directly in front of me. I looked down at the cover page. It was a comprehensive legal relinquishment of all my rights as the secondary executor of the estate, including a full waiver of any future claims against the company assets, the family properties, and the corporate accounts. "Sign it," Terence demanded, pointing a stiff finger directly at the document. "It is a final settlement agreement. I am offering you $10,000 in cash right now to sign away your executor rights and walk away from this family entirely. Take the money, start over somewhere else, and leave the adults to fix the mess. Take it right now, Zora, or I swear to you I will tie this estate up in probate court for the next 10 years, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing. Ensure Caleb has a future or walk out of here penniless. The choice is yours." I stared down at the thick stack of papers and then slowly raised my eyes to meet my brother's gaze. The hook was set perfectly. The financial trap he thought he had laid for me was completely ready to snap shut, and I was going to tear it entirely to shreds. "Is that your final offer, Terence?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "Because you are going to need a lot more than $10,000 to buy your way out of what is coming next." I picked up the thick stack of papers resting on the polished mahogany table. The top page was stamped with the heavy embossed seal of my parents' high-priced estate attorneys. I read the bold printed words centered at the top: "Full and final relinquishment of executorship and comprehensive settlement agreement." I ran my fingers over the crisp edge of the heavy stock paper, feeling the absolute absurdity of the moment. $10,000. That was the exact numerical value Terence had placed on my silence, my inheritance, and my entire future. It was not even enough money to cover a single month of Chloe's extravagant country club expenses, let alone provide any sort of meaningful security for Caleb. Aunt Vivian cleared her throat. The sound was small and nervous, but she forced herself to sit up straighter in her oversized black leather chair. She adjusted the lapels of her dark suit, desperately trying to project the matriarchal authority I had completely shattered the day before at the country club. "You should be immensely grateful." Zora Vivian said, her voice trembling just slightly before she forced it into a tone of harsh reprimand. "Your brother is being incredibly generous under the circumstances. He is pulling money out of his own pocket to help a single mother with absolutely no prospects. You have been entirely dependent on other people your whole life. You need to take that check and thank the Lord that Terence is kind enough not to leave you and that child out on the street." I did not even look at her. Looking at Vivian would validate her presence, and she was nothing more than a frightened insect buzzing around the edges of a much larger war. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my brother. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing Vivian's pathetic defense of him to die in the cold air of the boardroom. Terence pushed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen across the table. It rolled smoothly, stopping right at the edge of the document. "Sign the paper, Zora," he said, his voice tight with impatience. "We are done playing these games. I have real corporate fires to put out today, and I cannot babysit your emotional meltdowns." I picked up the gold pen. It was heavy and expensive, undoubtedly purchased with stolen company money. I looked at the golden nib and then I calmly tossed it over my shoulder. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter that made Chloe jump in her seat. I placed my hands flat on the thick settlement agreement and slid it forcefully across the table. It glided over the slick wood and hit Terrence right in the chest, spilling several pages onto his lap. "I am not signing anything, Terrence," I said, my voice perfectly level, "and I am certainly not walking away for a pathetic $10,000. Terrence erupted. He slammed both of his hands down on the table so hard the heavy crystal water glasses rattled. He shot up from his chair, looming over the table with his face flushed dark red with fury. "You arrogant, ungrateful witch!" he shouted, the polished CEO facade instantly dissolving into raw, panicked rage. "You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with. You think there is a massive fortune waiting for you in those accounts. You think Mom and Dad left behind a mountain of cash for you to leech off of. The estate is completely underwater, Zora. The company is heavily leveraged. We are drowning in operational debt." He leaned across the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "If you refuse to sign that waiver, I will bury you. I will drag this entire estate into probate court and keep it locked up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will hire teams of ruthless lawyers to challenge every single claim you make. You do not have the money to fight me. You will drown in legal fees before we even reach a judge. You will be bankrupt, homeless, and entirely ruined. I am offering you a lifeline, and you are too stupid to take it." I watched him rant and rave, taking in the slight tremor in his hands and the tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He was terrified. He was trying to use volume and intimidation to cover up the fact that he was financially backed into a corner. He was playing the exact same hand he had played our entire lives. I slowly walked around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. "You are sweating, Terrence," I said softly, stopping just a few feet away from where he stood. "You always sweat when you are trying to sell a massive lie." Terrence stiffened his eyes, darting toward Chloe, who looked completely confused by the sudden change in subject. "Let us take a quick walk down memory lane." I continued, projecting my voice so it carried cleanly to every corner of the room. I was a freshman working 2 jobs, waiting tables and cleaning offices at midnight to pay for the coding classes Mom and Dad refused to fund. You were a senior desperate to win the University Business Incubator grant because you had already blown your entire semester allowance on fraternity parties and expensive liquor. I spent 3 sleepless months writing a comprehensive business plan for an educational software platform. I mapped out the financial projections, the market analysis, and the initial wireframes. And you sneaked into my dorm room while I was at work and copied the entire file from my laptop. Aunt Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking down at her hands. She knew the story. The whole family knew the story. They had just chosen to rewrite it to protect the golden child. "You submitted my plan under your name," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on his panicked eyes. "You stood on a stage in front of a panel of wealthy investors, and you sold them my vision. You won $50,000 in seed funding. Mom and Dad threw you a massive party at the house. They called you a visionary. They said you were born to lead the family empire. They said I should learn from your brilliant example." I took another step closer, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper. "But we both know what happened next. Do we not, Terrence? You got the money, but you had absolutely no idea how to actually build the software. You did not understand the code, you did not understand the market, and you certainly did not possess the work ethic to figure it out. You blew through the $50,000 in 4 months, taking your friends on trips and pretending to be a successful tech founder. You are incredibly good at faking competence, Terrence. You know how to wear the suits and shake the hands. But you are absolutely terrible at actual execution. When the time comes to do the real work, you always collapse." "You shut your mouth, Zora Terrence," hissed his voice, dropping into a desperate guttural warning. He glanced nervously at the closed boardroom doors, terrified that the estate attorneys might walk in and hear the absolute destruction of his character. "You drove that startup into the ground." I continued, ignoring his warning entirely. "And now you have done the exact same thing to our parents' legacy. You took a thriving commercial real estate company and you hollowed it out from the inside. You spent 5 years treating corporate accounts like your personal piggy bank to fund your wife's luxury lifestyle and your own ego. You faked invoices and drained the operating funds. And now you are standing here trying to intimidate me with threats of endless legal fees because you know you do not have a single dollar left to your name. Terrence opened his mouth, but he was completely speechless. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He looked like a man who had just stepped off the edge of a cliff and was waiting for the ground to hit him. Before he could scramble for a defense, Chloe jumped out of her chair. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the table, glaring at me with absolute venom. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter liar!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing loudly in the large room. "You have spent your entire life resenting Terrence because your parents loved him more. They trusted him. They put him in charge because you were a failure. At least Terrence owns the family business. At least he is a respected CEO. What do you own, Zora? You own absolutely nothing. You are a homeless single mother begging for relevance." I turned my attention to Chloe, letting a slow, dark smile spread across my face. I looked at her expensive morning dress, her diamond tennis bracelet, and her perfectly styled hair. I was looking at a woman who was entirely funded by stolen money and who was about to lose every single ounce of her artificial status. I placed my hands on the back of the heavy leather chair, leaning forward, so I was looking directly at my brother, who was now gripping the edge of the table to keep his hands from shaking. "Are you entirely sure about that, Terrence?" I asked, my voice cutting through the room with crystal clear precision. "Are you sure I own nothing? Because the bank sold your defaulted commercial mortgages last night." The silence that followed my words was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that sucks all the oxygen out of a room. Terrence sat completely frozen in our father's massive leather chair. His hands were still resting on the polished mahogany table, but his knuckles had turned bone white. The arrogant, mocking sneer that had been permanently plastered across his face just moments ago melted away entirely. It was replaced by a sudden, sickening pale color that washed over his features from his forehead down to his expensive silk tie. Chloe looked back and forth between us, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in genuine confusion. She clearly had no idea what a defaulted commercial mortgage even meant, but she was highly attuned to the shifting power dynamics in the room. She could read the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her husband. She dropped her crumpled tissue onto the table, her performative grief instantly evaporating. Terrence blinked rapidly, swallowing hard as he desperately tried to regain his footing. He pushed himself back from the table, letting out a loud, forced bark of laughter that sounded entirely hollow. "You are completely out of your mind," Zora Terrence sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are having a psychotic break. You walk in here wearing a rented suit, throwing around financial terms you clearly do not understand. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. The bank would never discuss confidential corporate accounts with a disgraced, estranged family member." I did not give him a single second to breathe. I kept my eyes locked directly on his, watching the desperate lie crumble behind his pupils. $15,420,000. I stated, my voice smooth and echoing cleanly off the glass walls of the executive suite. "That is the exact figure, Terrence. That is the total amount of debt you accumulated by secretly leveraging our parents' prime real estate assets. You missed the last 4 consecutive payments. The bank was legally preparing to seize everything by the end of this month. But they did not have to seize it, did they? Because a private equity holding company swooped in late last night and purchased every single cent of your bad paper at a premium. I know the exact numbers, Terrence, because my chief financial officer is the one who authorized the wire transfer to buy your debt." Terrence's jaw slacked. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. He immediately resorted to his favorite defense mechanism: gaslighting. "She is completely delusional," Terrence announced loudly, turning his attention to Aunt Vivian and Chloe. "Look at her. The grief has completely shattered her reality. She is making up imaginary numbers and phantom investment firms just to desperately extort a payout from me. Tell her, Aunt Vivian. Tell her she needs psychiatric help, not a seat at this boardroom table." Aunt Vivian immediately sat up straight, eager to fulfill her role as his ultimate defender. The threat of her own exposure from our encounter at the country club yesterday was clearly momentarily eclipsed by her lifelong habit of tearing me down. She weaponized her aggressive church lady authority, leaning forward to glare at me across the expansive table. "Terrence is absolutely right," Vivian declared, her voice regaining its familiar grating pitch. "You have always been a pathological liar, Zora. Coming in here and disrupting a professional corporate environment with these wild psychotic accusations is disgraceful. You should be absolutely down on your knees thanking God that your brother is generous enough to offer you anything at all." Vivian gestured dramatically toward the thick settlement document resting on the table in front of me. $10,000 is a massive fortune for a single mother with absolutely no prospects and no husband to provide for her. Take that settlement check, Zora. Be grateful your brother is willing to overlook your complete lack of respect and leave this building before he changes his mind and calls security to throw you out on the pavement. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. I slowly read the bold printed words on the front page, full and final relinquishment of executorship and comprehensive settlement agreement. I stared at the heavy gold pen resting right beside the document. I did not pick it up. I simply placed my fingertips on the edge of the crisp white paper and slid the entire legal packet firmly back across the mahogany table. It glided over the slick wood and came to a stop directly in front of Terrence. "I am not signing your pathetic settlement, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. Terrence completely lost his temper. The polished CEO facade shattered entirely. He slammed both of his hands down onto the table with such violent force that the crystal water glasses rattled and tipped, spilling ice water across the polished wood. He shot up from his chair, looming over the table with his face flushed dark red with raw, panicked rage. "You want to fight me?" he shouted, a vein bulging aggressively in his neck. "You think you can tie this estate up in court? The company is heavily leveraged, Zora. We are drowning in operational debt. I have the best corporate litigators in Atlanta on retainer. You will not survive the legal fees required to fight me. You will be bankrupt and living in a shelter in less than a month. I am the only one holding this family together." I smiled. It was a cold, genuine smile that made him instantly stop shouting. "You always resort to loud, aggressive threats when you are terrified, Terrence," I said, tilting my head slightly as I studied his panic. "It is your ultimate tell. You did the exact same thing during your senior year of college. Do you remember that?" Terrence stiffened, his eyes darting toward Chloe, who looked completely confused by the sudden change in subject. "Let us take a quick walk down memory lane." I continued, projecting my voice so it carried cleanly to every corner of the room. I was a freshman working 3 jobs, waiting tables in Buckhead and cleaning offices at midnight just to pay for my coding classes. You were a senior desperate to win the University Business Incubator grant because you had already blown your entire semester allowance on fraternity parties and expensive liquor. I spent 6 grueling months writing a comprehensive business plan for an educational software platform. I mapped out the financial projections, the market analysis, and the initial wireframes. And you sneaked into my dorm room while I was at work, copied the entire file from my laptop, and submitted it under your own name. Aunt Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking down at her hands. She knew the story. The whole family knew the story. They had simply chosen to rewrite history to protect the golden child. "You stood on a stage in front of a panel of wealthy investors, and you sold them my vision," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on his wide, terrified eyes. "You won $50,000 in seed funding. Mom and Dad threw you a massive party at the estate. They called you a visionary. They said you were born to lead the family empire. They told me I should learn from your brilliant example." I took a slow, deliberate step around the edge of the table, moving closer to where he stood. "But we both know what happened next, do we not, Terrence? You got the money, but you had absolutely no idea how to actually build the software. You did not understand the underlying code, you did not understand the market metrics, and you certainly did not possess the work ethic to figure it out." You blew through the $50,000 grant in 4 months, taking your friends on ski trips and pretending to be a highly successful tech founder. I stopped just a few feet away from him, my voice dropping to a sharp, cutting whisper. You have always been incredibly good at faking competence, Terrence. You know exactly how to wear the expensive suits and shake the right hands. But you are absolutely terrible at actual execution. When it comes time to do the real work, you always collapse. Shut your mouth! Zora, Terrence hissed, his voice trembling with a desperate guttural warning. He glanced nervously at the closed boardroom doors, terrified that anyone outside might hear the absolute destruction of his character. You drove that startup directly into the ground. I continued, ignoring his warning entirely. And now you have done the exact same thing to our parents' legacy. But this time, I am not a freshman working 3 jobs, and I am not going to let you steal my future to cover up your massive failures. I reached into the sleek interior pocket of my emerald jacket and withdrew a thick folded sheaf of premium financial paper. I placed it flat on the mahogany wood and slid it firmly down the center of the table. The heavy pages stopped dead center, perfectly positioned between Terrence, Chloe, and Aunt Vivian. That is a certified, itemized financial ledger, I announced. It highlights exactly how you have been grossly embezzling from this company for the last 3 years. It exposes the dummy corporate entities you set up. It exposes the heavily inflated invoices for phantom property renovations. And it shows exactly where every single stolen dollar was routed. Chloe sneered, leaning forward to look at the document. You are just a bitter, jealous sister trying to tear your brother down, she snapped. But as her eyes scanned the top page, her sneer vanished completely. Her breath hitched in her throat. Look closely, Chloe, I instructed. Look at the $500,000 funneled directly into your fake interior design business. Look at the country club initiation fees and the lease payments for your luxury cars, all paid for with money. Terrence systematically drained from my parents' operating accounts while they were fighting for their lives in the hospital. Chloe slumped back in her chair, the color draining from her face as she realized her husband was not a wealthy CEO, but a desperate thief. Aunt Vivian scoffed, reaching out with a manicured hand to aggressively flip to the second page of the ledger. This is just forged garbage, she muttered. Anyone can print numbers on a piece of paper. But as her eyes moved down the columns of the second page, her voice abruptly died in her throat. The aggressive, self-righteous posture completely vanished. Her face turned an ashen, sickly gray. Her hand began to tremble violently against the paper. Keep reading, Aunt Vivian, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Read the highlighted sections detailing the massive, unapproved corporate loans Terrence authorized. Read the dates that perfectly align with your husband's massive gambling losses. The $60,000 to cover his underground poker debts. The $200,000 to pay off his sports bookie. Terrence did not just steal to fund his own lifestyle. He robbed my parents blind to keep the loan sharks away from your front door. And it is all documented right there in black and white. Terrence lunged forward. The arrogant CEO persona was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, panicked movements of a cornered criminal. He grabbed the thick ledger with both hands, his fingers crumpling the crisp paper. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wild with sheer desperation. He gripped the edges of the pages, preparing to rip the entire ledger in half to destroy the evidence of his crimes. Before his hands could even move, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding, authoritative thud. The sudden noise made Terrence jump, dropping the crumpled papers back onto the table. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Sterling, the family's longtime estate attorney. He was an imposing, silver-haired man who had managed my parents' legal affairs for over 3 decades. He stepped into the room, his posture rigid, carrying a thick, battered leather briefcase in his right hand. He looked around the tense, silent room, his eyes lingering on Terrence's panicked face before settling on me with a look of profound, quiet respect. I apologize for the delay, Mr. Sterling said, his voice strict and echoing loudly in the massive space. But we have a will to read. The heavy oak doors clicking shut behind Mr. Sterling sounded like a judge dropping a gavel. The suffocating tension in the executive boardroom immediately shifted. Terrence was still standing over the mahogany table, with his hands hovering above the financial ledger, I had just weaponized against him. The sheer terror that had contorted his face a second ago was violently shoved aside as he desperately scrambled to reconstruct his polished corporate facade. Terrence aggressively yanked down the hem of his charcoal suit jacket, buttoning it with trembling fingers. He plastered a wide, artificial smile across his face and stepped quickly away from the damning evidence on the table. He marched toward the doorway, extending his right hand, with the manufactured warmth of a politician greeting a major donor. "Mr. Sterling, it is wonderful to see you," Terrence declared, his voice unnaturally loud and booming. "I must apologize for the chaotic atmosphere. You know how emotional these family transitions can be. But your timing is actually perfect." Zora was just leaving. "We have already reached a comprehensive private settlement regarding her portion of the estate. There is no need for her to sit through the complex legal formalities today." I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the far end of the long table watching my brother attempt to casually dismiss me from my own family legacy. I kept my hands folded perfectly in front of me, projecting total, absolute stillness. Mr. Sterling did not reach out to shake my brother's hand. He simply stopped walking and looked down at Terrence's extended arm with an expression of profound, glacial indifference. The older attorney had managed my parents' legal affairs for over 30 years. He knew every single secret, every hidden asset, and every dark corner of the Williams family empire. He was not a man who could be charmed, intimidated, or managed. Sterling bypassed Terrence entirely. He walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the mahogany table. He set his battered leather briefcase down right next to the itemized ledger detailing my brother's massive embezzlement. Sterling glanced down at the pages, then looked at the thick settlement document Terrence had tried to force me to sign. He reached out with one manicured finger and pushed Terrence's $10,000 extortion attempt aside, as if it were a piece of filthy trash. "You are mistaken, Terrence," Mr. Sterling said, his voice deep and vibrating with absolute legal authority. "Zora is not leaving this room. She is a required primary party to the proceedings today. Furthermore, she has not signed any settlement agreement, nor would I ever advise her to sign a document drafted without my direct oversight. I suggest you return to your seat immediately so we can conduct this business properly." The fake smile slid right off Terrence's face. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, entirely humiliated by the sharp public reprimand. Chloe shrank back into her black leather chair, clutching her tissue tightly. Aunt Vivian, who had been practically shouting a few minutes ago, suddenly found the grain of the wood table incredibly fascinating. Terrence swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He slowly walked back to the head of the table and sank into my father's chair. But the panic was taking over again. He knew the bank had sold his defaulted mortgages. He knew I had the exact ledger proving he had stolen millions. He was completely out of ammunition, and he needed to secure his most valuable physical asset before Sterling officially opened the will and stripped him of his power. Terrence reached down into his leather briefcase again, his movements erratic and jerky. He pulled out a thick document bound in a heavy blue legal cover. He slapped it down onto the table and slid it forcefully toward Mr. Sterling. "Before we get into the formalities of the will, there is a separate legal matter we need to officially log into the estate record," Terrence announced, his voice regaining a desperate, aggressive edge. "That is the executed deed to the primary family estate in Buckhead and the 3 surrounding commercial properties. Mom and Dad signed them over to me 6 weeks ago. They wanted to ensure the core family legacy was protected from any operational creditors. I am the sole legal owner of those properties as of last month." Chloe immediately sat up straight, sensing a lifeline. She nodded her head vigorously, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife. "It is entirely true, Mr. Sterling," she chimed in, her voice high and breathless. "I was standing right there in the living room when they signed the transfer. They explicitly said they wanted Terrence to have the house because he was the only one capable of maintaining the family image." Aunt Vivian muttered a quick sound of agreement, nodding along with the fabricated story. I watched the pathetic performance from the end of the table. I knew my parents. They would never quietly sign away the absolute crown jewel of their real estate empire in their living room without a battery of lawyers present. Terrence had forged the signatures. He was trying to preemptively carve out a massive chunk of wealth before the estate was officially settled. He was relying on Sterling to simply accept the document at face value. Mr. Sterling did not look surprised. He did not look impressed. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He unfolded them with agonizing slowness and slid them onto his face. He picked up the heavy blue-backed document, holding it up to the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He did not read the entire document. He simply flipped to the final page, inspecting the signatures and the bright red notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner. The silence in the boardroom was so absolute, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Chloe as she waited for the validation of their massive lie. Mr. Sterling took his glasses off and folded them deliberately. He dropped the deed flat onto the mahogany table. The heavy paper hit the wood with a dull, hollow smack. "This document is entirely null and void," Mr. Sterling stated, his tone clinical and completely devoid of emotion. "It possesses absolutely no legal standing whatsoever." Terrence jolted forward, gripping the armrests of his chair. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising into a shout. "It is fully signed and notarized. I have the legal right to those properties. You cannot just ignore a binding contract because Zora is sitting here crying about it. I am invalidating it because the signatures on this document are fraudulent." "Terrence," Mr. Sterling countered, cutting through my brother's volume with icy precision. "And I know they are fraudulent because your parents lost their legal capacity to execute this specific transfer 2 months before they passed away." Aunt Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Terrence stared at the attorney, his mouth slightly open, completely failing to comprehend what was happening. 2 months prior to their fatal accident, your mother and father requested an emergency private meeting at my office, Mr. Sterling explained, resting his hands flat on his leather briefcase. They did not come alone. They brought a highly specialized independent forensic accountant. They had discovered the massive discrepancies in the corporate operating accounts. They found the dummy limited liability companies you established in Delaware. They traced the massive unauthorized capital withdrawals you used to cover your catastrophic gambling debts and your wife's excessive personal expenses. The color vanished from Chloe's face. She looked at Terrence with sheer undisguised panic, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of the crimes her husband had committed. "They knew everything," Terrence, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping into a register of profound disappointment. "They knew you had been systematically bleeding their life's work dry for 3 years. It broke their hearts entirely. But they were brilliant business people, and they acted immediately to stop the hemorrhaging. That very afternoon in my office, they signed a comprehensive legal revocation. They stripped you of your executive power of attorney. They completely removed you from all corporate banking authorizations. They dissolved your ability to act as an agent for this company in any capacity." Sterling tapped a strict, rigid finger against the forged deed resting on the table. "You had absolutely no legal authority to draft this transfer, Terrence. And your parents certainly never signed it because they spent the last 2 months of their lives working with federal investigators to prepare a massive embezzlement case against you." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Terrence stumbled back in his chair, looking like he had been struck violently in the chest. He had spent years thinking he was outsmarting our parents, thinking he was pulling the strings behind their backs. He had no idea they had caught him. He had no idea they died, knowing their golden child was a pathetic, ruthless thief. Aunt Vivian practically collapsed into her seat, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at Terrence in absolute horror. The golden boy illusion she had worshipped her entire life was lying dead on the boardroom table. Terrence could not handle the exposure. His mind completely snapped. He kicked his heavy leather chair back so violently it crashed into the glass wall behind him. He stood up, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You are lying!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips as he glared at Mr. Sterling. "You are conspiring with her. You are trying to steal my company. I am the eldest son. I am the rightful heir to this empire. I did all the heavy lifting. I shook the hands. I closed the deals. I demand to know what the real will says right now. Read the damn document and give me what is mine." Mr. Sterling did not flinch at the violent outburst. He looked at Terence with the calm, clinical detachment of a man watching a temper tantrum. He reached down and unlatched the brass locks on his battered briefcase. They clicked open sharply in the quiet room. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy ivory envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax, bearing my father's personal signet ring. Sterling broke the wax seal with his thumb. The dry cracking sound echoed loudly. He pulled out the heavy parchment pages, unfolding them with deliberate care. He smoothed the creases against the table and looked directly into my brother's enraged, bloodshot eyes. "The final testament of your parents is quite clear," Mr. Sterling said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Terence, your inheritance is exactly $1, one single dollar." The words hit the heavy, polished mahogany table and instantly shattered the remaining fragile fragments of Terence's manufactured corporate illusion. The phrase hung in the air, echoing against the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the executive suite. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in an absolute vacuum of silence. No one breathed. No one moved. Even the faint, steady hum of the Atlanta City traffic 15 stories below seemed to completely vanish as the sheer magnitude of the statement settled over the boardroom. Chloe was the first to break the quiet. A sharp, high-pitched gasp tore from her throat, followed immediately by rapid, shallow, frantic breaths. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white as her chest heaved violently against the expensive fabric of her black morning dress. "No!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that forced Aunt Vivian to physically flinch. "No, that is an absolute mistake. You read it wrong, Mr. Sterling. You missed a zero or a page. That cannot possibly be right." Mr. Sterling did not even glance in her direction. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the heavy ivory parchment paper resting in his hands, his posture completely rigid and unyielding. "I assure you, madam, I am reading the text exactly as it was legally drafted and notarized by your late in-laws." Mr. Sterling replied, his voice a flat, impenetrable wall of professionalism. Chloe leaped out of her chair, her sensible black heels scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the attorney. "You are lying. My husband is the CEO of this company. He is the eldest son and the rightful heir to this family. You cannot just march into this building and hand him a single dollar. We will sue you. We will sue your entire firm for gross negligence and malpractice. I will personally see to it that your license is revoked. We are going to take this to the highest court in the state and completely destroy your career." Aunt Vivian, meanwhile, looked as though she had been physically struck by a high-voltage current. She was entirely speechless. Her trembling hand flew to her chest, her fingers desperately clutching the strand of thick, expensive pearls resting around her neck. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. The self-righteous matriarch, who had spent the last 24 hours berating me, praising Terence, and demanding my total submission, was completely paralyzed by the sheer absolute humiliation unfolding in front of her. She stared at the forged property deed Terence had just tried to pass off, and then looked at the real, legally binding will in Mr. Sterling's hands. The realization hit her with devastating force. Her golden nephew was nothing more than a desperate criminal, and her own secret, unapproved corporate loans were about to be fully exposed to the harsh light of day. She slumped backward into her oversized leather chair, completely neutralized. Mr. Sterling ignored Chloe's frantic hyperventilating and empty threats of litigation. He slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat with a quiet, commanding sound, and continued reading from the thick pages. "To my daughter Zora Williams, we leave the entirety of our corporate holdings, including the primary commercial real estate business and all associated subsidiary operating entities." Mr. Sterling read, his voice projecting a calm, devastating authority. "We grant her absolute and sole control as the primary executor of the estate, effective immediately upon our passing." I stood at the far end of the long table, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my hands folded neatly in front of me. I did not smile. I did not gloat or offer a single expression of triumph. I simply absorbed the tremendous weight of my parents' final protective act. They had seen the rot festering inside their empire. They had tracked the massive trail of debt and deceit Terrence had desperately tried to bury. And in their final days, they had meticulously dismantled his unearned power and handed the keys to the only person they trusted to rebuild the foundation. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling continued turning to the second page of the heavy document. To Zora Williams, we leave the primary family estate located in Buckhead, valued at approximately $4 million free and clear of any encumbrances, along with all remaining liquid assets contained within our personal and private banking accounts. It is our express legal wish that these specific assets be utilized to secure her future and the educational future of our grandson, Caleb. This is completely unacceptable, Chloe wailed, pacing frantically behind her leather chair and pulling at her perfectly styled hair. Terrence, you have to do something right now. Tell him this is illegal. We have exorbitant country club dues to pay. We have the lease payments on the imported cars. We have the mortgage on the penthouse. We cannot possibly survive on a single dollar. Fix this, Terrence. Terrence finally snapped. The sheer paralyzing shock that had kept him pinned to his father's chair instantly violently morphed into explosive, unhinged rage. He kicked his heavy leather chair backward with brutal force. The heavy piece of furniture tipped over and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor, sending a sharp echo through the room. He began to pace the length of the boardroom like a caged rabid animal. His hands were balled into tight, aggressive fists at his sides, his chest heaving as he marched back and forth along the expansive glass wall overlooking the city skyline. "You planned this!" Zora Terrence roared, spinning around to point a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "You manipulated them. You sneaked into their hospital room while I was busy running this entire company, and you poisoned their minds against me. You cried about your pathetic poor life, and you begged them for a massive handout. You brainwashed them on their deathbeds." I watched him rant and rave, marveling at his absolute refusal to accept reality. His ability to project his own failures onto everyone else was almost pathological. "They literally hired a forensic accountant, Terrence," I replied, my voice cutting through his shouting with steady, icy precision. "They tracked your dummy Delaware corporations. They saw the hundreds of thousands of dollars you routed to your sportsbookie and your underground poker games. I did not poison their minds. Your own sloppy, blatant theft exposed you completely. They knew exactly what you were." "I was protecting this family," Terrence screamed back, completely ignoring the factual itemized ledger sitting right on the table in front of him. "I took those operating funds to keep the business moving forward. I made aggressive investments. I took necessary corporate risks that Mom and Dad were too old and too cowardly to take themselves. You know absolutely nothing about high-level corporate finance, Zora. You spent your entire life playing with colorful spreadsheets, while I was in the trenches making the hard, brutal calls that kept our name relevant." He marched toward me, closing the distance until he was standing just a few feet away. His face was twisted in a mask of pure, desperate aggression, the veins in his forehead pulsing visibly against his skin. "You coerced two dying people into rewriting their legacy just to satisfy your own bitter, jealous vendetta against me." Terrence spat his breath, hitting the air between us. "You could never stand the fact that they picked me to lead this company. You could never stand the fact that I was the successful one and you were just the dependent sister. You stole my birthright." I did not back away. I held my ground, meeting his furious, bloodshot gaze with total, impenetrable calm. He was projecting his entire lifetime of intense inadequacy onto me, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative to make himself the victim of a grand conspiracy. He wanted me to flinch. He wanted me to scream back and validate his chaotic energy. But I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, unwavering stare. And then something entirely unexpected shifted in the room. Terrence stopped pacing. He stood frozen a few feet away from me, his chest rising and falling heavily as he stared at my impassive face. He looked down at the itemized ledger, exposing his massive embezzlement, then looked over at the forged property deed Mr. Sterling had just invalidated. The frantic, cornered animal panic in his eyes slowly began to recede, replaced by a dark, highly toxic realization. He reached up and casually straightened his silk tie, his erratic breathing slowly leveling out. A slow, chilling smirk began to pull at the corners of his mouth, erasing the mask of a victim and replacing it with the arrogant CEO persona he wore so well. He let out a low, dark laugh that scraped harshly against the quiet walls of the boardroom. He looked over at Mr. Sterling, then back to me, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin. "Fine," Terrence said, his voice dropping into a smooth, deadly, and deeply mocking register. "You want the estate, Zora. You want the heavy crown. Take it. Take the title to the massive house in Buckhead. Take the fancy executive chair. Take every single scrap of useless paper Mr. Sterling has in that battered briefcase." He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished mahogany table, looking at me with absolute triumphant malice burning in his eyes. "But you just inherited a sinking ship." The silence that followed his dark, arrogant laugh felt heavy and suffocating. Terrence stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, and he actually smiled. It was not the desperate, panicked expression he wore just seconds prior. This was a look of pure, calculated malice. He casually brushed a speck of lint from the lapel of his charcoal suit, looking completely rejuvenated by his own destructive revelation. "You honestly thought you had me cornered, did you not?" Zora Terrence asked, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "You thought you could just walk into this building, hand over a financial ledger, and instantly become the queen of the Williams empire. You thought Mom and Dad were brilliant for cutting me out of the will and leaving you everything. But you are forgetting one very important fact about me. I am always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in this family." Aunt Vivian remained completely silent, her hands still trembling in her lap. Mr. Sterling stood beside his battered leather briefcase, his face a mask of absolute professional detachment. He did not interrupt. He simply watched Terrence dig his own grave deeper. I kept my eyes locked on my brother. I did not flinch. I did not offer him a single fraction of an inch of emotional ground. When I realized Mom and Dad were bringing in auditors, I knew exactly what they were planning. Terrence continued pacing slowly behind his chair. I knew they were going to try to strip my authority and rewrite their legacy to punish me. So I made sure their precious legacy was entirely worthless. Because I still held the executive power of attorney and full financial control at the time, I took out a series of highly aggressive corporate loans. I did not just borrow against the company operating accounts, Zora. I cross-collateralized every single asset this family owns. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table and staring directly at me with a triumphant sneer. I leveraged the primary estate in Buckhead. I leveraged the commercial properties downtown. I tied every single piece of brick and glass this family owns to massive high-yield short-term loans from private equity lenders. The estate you just so proudly inherited has exactly $15 million in toxic, unpayable debt attached directly to its title. Terrence let out another harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head in manufactured pity. "You did not inherit a fortune, Zora. You inherited a financial nuclear bomb. The moment Mr. Sterling files that will with the probate court, all of that debt instantly transfers to you as the sole executor and primary beneficiary. You are now personally responsible for $15 million in defaulted loans." The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted violently. The sheer magnitude of the debt hung in the air like a physical weight. I watched the realization wash over Chloe's face. The panicked hyperventilating that had consumed her just moments ago abruptly stopped. She blinked rapidly, processing the financial trap her husband had laid. A slow, cruel smile began to stretch across her perfectly glossed lips. The venomous, arrogant woman from the country club was instantly resurrected. She sat up straight in her chair, smoothing the front of her expensive black morning dress. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Oh, this is absolutely poetic," Chloe declared, her voice ringing with triumphant mockery. "You really thought you had won. You strutted in here wearing your little emerald suit, acting like you were the new matriarch of the family. You tried to humiliate us and throw us out on the street. But you are the one who is entirely ruined. She picked up her crystal water glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down with a sharp clink. You cannot afford to manage this estate, Zora, Chloe continued, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. You do not have a single dime to your name. How are you going to pay the estate taxes on a $4 million property? How are you going to pay the retainer for the army of corporate lawyers you will need to fight the creditors? You cannot even afford to keep the lights on in that massive house. The private equity firm will be filing the foreclosure paperwork by the end of the week. The bank is going to seize the Buckhead estate by Friday morning. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest and looking me up and down with absolute disgust. You are going to lose the house. You are going to lose the commercial properties. The creditors are going to strip this entire company down to the studs and sell it for parts. And when they are done, they are going to come after whatever pathetic little savings account you have left. You are going to be bankrupt. You will have a destroyed credit score, and you will still be exactly what you have always been. A homeless single mother begging for relevance. Terrence nodded in agreement, feeding off his wife's venomous energy. He walked around the side of the table, moving closer to where I stood. He wanted to physically intimidate me. He wanted to stand over me and watch me break down and cry. He wanted to see the exact moment my spirit shattered under the weight of his calculated destruction. You should have taken the settlement check, Zora Terrence said, his voice dropping into a patronizing, mocking tone. I offered you $10,000 in cash. I was trying to do you a favor. I was trying to give you a clean exit so you could take your kid and start a quiet little life somewhere far away from the adults. But you just had to be arrogant. You had to try and play the boss, too. He stopped just a few feet away from me, shoving his hands into his suit pockets. He tilted his head, studying my face and waiting for the tears. Now you get absolutely nothing, Terrence stated, his words laced with dark finality. Actually, that is not true. You get a mountain of toxic debt and a public humiliation that will follow you for the rest of your life. I am going to walk out of this building clean. My name is no longer on the executive accounts. Mom and Dad made sure of that when they revoked my authority. They thought they were punishing me, but they actually shielded me from the fallout. You are the sole executor now, Zora. You are the one left holding the bag. The creditors are your problem now. He let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head as if he genuinely pitied my stupidity. I will give you 5 minutes to gather your things and get out of my sight, Terrence said, turning his back on me and walking toward his briefcase. I am sure there is a bus running back to whatever cheap apartment you are renting. The room was perfectly quiet. Aunt Vivian was staring at me, her eyes wide, waiting to see how I would react to being utterly destroyed. Chloe was smirking, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet with an air of total superiority. Terrence was snapping his briefcase shut, acting as though the meeting was officially adjourned and he had emerged completely victorious. They expected me to scream. They expected me to collapse into a chair and beg them for a way out. They expected the weight of a $15 million debt to crush me into total submission. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight or lower my gaze. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify my total lack of reaction. I looked at Terrence's smug back, and then I looked at Chloe's triumphant smile. I absorbed every single insult, every mocking threat, and every ounce of their manufactured victory. I turned my head slowly, looking away from my brother and focusing entirely on the imposing silver-haired attorney standing quietly by the table. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice smooth, clear, and entirely devoid of panic. Terrence froze, his hand resting on the handle of his briefcase. He slowly turned his head, looking at me with a sudden flicker of uncertainty. My absolute calm was completely unnerving him. It did not fit the script he had written in his head. Mr. Sterling, I believe there is one final section of the will to address regarding the executor's financial capability, I stated, keeping my eyes locked on the attorney. We need to ensure all legal requirements are fully met before we adjourn today. Mr. Sterling did not show a single trace of emotion. He simply reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary file folder. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at me. Indeed there is, Zora. Mr. Sterling replied, his deep voice cutting through the tension with absolute precision. We must address the specific contingency clause your parents implemented regarding the immediate stabilization of the corporate debt. Mr. Sterling unclasped the secondary file folder, smoothing the heavy watermarked parchment flat against the polished mahogany wood. He did not look at Terrence. He walked purposefully past my brother, moving directly toward the sleek digital control console built seamlessly into the center of the expansive boardroom table. He retrieved a sleek silver tablet from his briefcase and connected it to the central hub. Above us, the massive 80-inch flat-screen display mounted on the far wall of the executive suite hummed quietly to life, casting a cool blue glow over the room. Your parents were fully aware of the catastrophic financial liabilities attached to this estate. Mr. Sterling explained, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon performing a routine procedure. They understood that the $15 million in leveraged corporate debt could potentially destroy the remaining clean assets if handled improperly. Therefore, they instituted a highly specific contingency clause within the bylaws of the executorship. Terrence let out a sharp, derisive snort. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back heavily into my father's chair. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, completely convinced that he had outmaneuvered a pair of deceased business titans. Of course they did. Terrence mocked, shaking his head in manufactured pity. They panicked. They tried to build a safety net to protect their precious little girl from the real world. So what is the brilliant legal loophole, Sterling? Let me guess. The estate reverts to a blind trust handled by your firm because Zora is completely incapable of managing a corporate bankruptcy. Mr. Sterling kept his eyes focused entirely on the tablet screen, swiping his finger across the digital interface. The clause dictates that in order to assume full legal control of the estate and its associated debts, the named executor must provide immediate, irrefutable proof of financial solvency, Mr. Sterling stated clearly. The court requires a verified demonstration of personal liquidity that exceeds the total liability of the estate. If the named executor cannot instantly prove they possess the personal capital to absorb the $15 million debt, without defaulting, the executorship is immediately forfeited. Terrence threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced aggressively off the glass walls. He uncrossed his arms and slammed his hands down onto the table, looking at me with pure, unadulterated triumph. "Well, there it is," Terrence declared, a massive grin splitting his face. "That is the end of the line, Zora. You hear that? You have to prove you can cover $15 million in toxic corporate debt right this very second. You are absolutely disqualified. You cannot even cover the cost of a decent lawyer, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial bailout." He turned his attention to Mr. Sterling, waving his hand dismissively toward the large blank screen on the wall. "Put it up on the board!" Sterling Terrence demanded, his voice dripping with absolute arrogant certainty. "Let us get this pathetic charade over with. Show us her empty bank accounts. Show us the overdue rent notices and the maxed-out credit cards. She is a struggling freelance designer who works from her kitchen table. She probably has less than $2,000 to her name. Put her miserable little financial statement on the screen and officially declare her unfit so I can take my company back and clean up this mess." Aunt Vivian let out a long breath of relief, her rigid posture finally relaxing. She patted her chest, nodding along with Terrence's assessment. She was entirely ready to return to her comfortable reality where I was the family failure and her golden nephew was the supreme leader. Chloe mirrored the sentiment, crossing her legs and offering me a tight, superior smirk. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I let his insults wash over me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp sense of anticipation. He had spent his entire life underestimating me. He had spent years actively working to keep me in the dirt because my failure was the only thing that made his fraudulent success feel real. He was so deeply blinded by his own narcissism that he could not even fathom a universe where I had outgrown the box he placed me in. Mr. Sterling tapped a single key on his digital console. The 80-inch screen on the wall instantly flashed from a blank blue canvas to a highly detailed, comprehensive financial presentation. Bold black letters across the top of the display read, Executive Financial Dossier, verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Terrence did not even look at the screen initially. He was too busy staring at me, waiting for my face to crumple into tears of humiliation. As requested by the legal parameters of the estate, Mr. Sterling announced, projecting his voice so it filled every corner of the room. I present the fully verified and audited personal financial dossier of Zora Williams. I watched Terrence slowly turn his head toward the massive display. His arrogant grin remained plastered on his face for exactly 3 seconds. The first slide on the screen did not show an empty checking account. It did not show overdue utility bills or struggling freelance contracts. It displayed a massive, sprawling corporate hierarchy chart dominated by a sleek, modern logo that every single person in the business world immediately recognized. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and began reading the document aloud, his tone perfectly steady. Zora Williams is formally recognized and legally verified as the sole Chief Executive Officer founder and 78% majority shareholder of Aura Ed. Mr. Sterling stated. The air vanished from the room. Terrence's jaw slacked. The color drained out of his face with such violent speed, he looked as though he might physically vomit. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning bone white, as his eyes darted frantically across the screen. Aura Ed is a globally recognized educational technology platform, currently operating in 34 countries. Mr. Sterling continued tapping his screen to switch to the next slide. It displayed a staggering sequence of profit margins and global market share analytics. According to the most recent independent valuation conducted prior to their upcoming initial public offering, the enterprise is currently valued at $850 million. Aunt Vivian let out a strangled, gasping sound. She grabbed the edge of her leather chair, looking back and forth between me and the glowing screen on the wall. Her mouth hung open, completely paralyzed by the sheer astronomical scale of the numbers staring back at her. She had spent the last hour treating me like a beggar looking for scraps, and now she was sitting in the shadow of an actual titan. Terrence was completely suffocating. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He just stood there, shaking his head back and forth in rapid denial. He recognized the name of the company. The entire tech industry knew the name. But more importantly, Terrence recognized the underlying infrastructure being displayed on the presentation slides. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the table, my emerald heels clicking sharply against the quiet floor. Do you recognize the corporate architecture, Terrence? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He could not form a coherent sentence. It is the exact same educational software platform I designed in my dorm room all those years ago, I said, stepping closer until I was standing right across from his trembling figure. The exact same business model you stole from me to win that seed money. You thought you destroyed my future when you took my plan and drove it into the ground. But you forgot one crucial detail, Terrence. You stole the paper, but I owned the brain that wrote it. I placed my hands on the back of a leather chair, leaning forward slightly. I did not stop working when you stole from me, I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. I took out student loans. I worked 4 jobs. I rebuilt the entire platform from scratch, coding every single line myself. I launched it privately. I secured ethical venture capital, and I scaled it into a global enterprise. I did not buy expensive suits or lease luxury cars. I built a quiet, invisible empire while you were busy playing pretend in our father's office. Mr. Sterling tapped his screen one final time, bringing up the ultimate summary page. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling declared, driving the final nail into the coffin, we have fully verified Ms. Williams' personal liquid assets independent of her corporate holdings. She possesses more than sufficient private capital to instantly absorb and clear the $15 million debt attached to this estate without liquidating a single corporate share. She is thoroughly and legally qualified to assume total control of this executorship immediately. Terrence's knees literally gave out. He collapsed backward into my father's chair, landing with a heavy, dull thud. His arrogant, polished facade was entirely gone. He was nothing but a hollow, desperate shell staring at a reality he could not possibly comprehend. He had spent his entire life building a fragile house of cards, and I had just crushed it with a single breath. Chloe was sitting next to him, completely overwhelmed. She was entirely out of her depth. She possessed absolutely no understanding of corporate finance, global valuations, or technology platforms. Her brain could only process the immediate, tangible threats to her luxury lifestyle. She squinted at the massive screen, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. She stared at the bottom of the display where the screen listed the parent holding company that managed my private assets. It was a distinct corporate entity named Apex Financial Acquisitions. "Wait," Chloe said, her voice trembling as she looked frantically around the room. "What does this mean? I do not understand any of this legal jargon. Why does her holding company name look so familiar? What does this mean for the Buckhead house? What does this mean for the debt Terrence owes the bank?" I smiled. It was a slow, cold, utterly ruthless smile. I looked directly into Chloe's terrified eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my brother, who was staring at me with the sudden dawning realization of a man stepping onto a landmine. "It means Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, absolute finality. "It means I am the private equity firm that bought your husband's $15 million debt last night." Chloe stared at me with her mouth hanging open. The words private equity firm and $15 million bounced around her brain, failing to properly connect. She looked at Terrence, hoping he would burst into laughter and tell her this was all a ridiculous bluff. But Terrence was not laughing. My brother was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles looked like polished marble. He was staring at me with the wide, unblinking eyes of a man who had just stepped off a blind cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and crush him. "You bought my debt?" Terrence whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming arrogance. It sounded like a dry, rasping scrape against the quiet room. "That is illegal. You cannot secretly buy my commercial paper. That is a massive conflict of interest." Mr. Sterling did not even look up from his tablet. "There is absolutely no conflict of interest," Mr. Sterling stated, his tone perfectly, even and clinical. "Apex Financial Acquisitions is a fully registered and heavily regulated corporate entity. They execute distressed asset purchases regularly on the open market. When you missed your fourth consecutive loan payment last week, you triggered a severe default covenant. Your original creditors immediately placed your entire leveraged portfolio on the distressed market to mitigate their institutional losses. Apex Financial acquired the paper completely legally. It is standard corporate procedure for handling toxic debt." Terrence shook his head side to side, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and erratic. "No. No, you do not understand, Sterling. If she owns the debt, she controls the collateral." "Exactly," Mr. Sterling confirmed, tapping another button on his console. The massive screen on the wall shifted again, displaying a terrifyingly clear, itemized list of seized corporate assets. "And because you are currently in breach of contract, Apex Financial Acquisitions has the immediate legal right to call in the loans. Ms. Williams, acting as the primary shareholder of Apex, now holds the absolute right to foreclose on your personal residence, the downtown commercial properties, and all associated accounts you used to leverage this stolen cash. Furthermore, she has the unilateral authority to seize your private personal assets to satisfy the remaining balance." Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She shoved her chair back, scrambling away from the table as if the wood itself had suddenly caught fire. "You bankrupted us!" Chloe shrieked, turning her absolute terror entirely onto her husband. "You told me the company was thriving, Terrence. You told me the country club dues and the car leases were tax write-offs. You told me we were untouchable. We are going to lose the house. She owns our house." Terrence could not even look at his wife. His gaze remained locked entirely on the glowing screen displaying his complete financial destruction. "It gets so much worse, Terrence," I said, taking another step toward the head of the table. "I did not just buy the commercial paper. I bought the personal markers you signed to cover your underground gambling losses. The loan sharks you were so terrified of, the violent men you stole from our parents to pay off. They sold your remaining markers to a shell company last month. I bought that shell company yesterday morning. I own your corporate debt. I own your personal debt. I own the roof over your head and the cars in your driveway. Aunt Vivian pressed herself so deeply into the corner of her massive leather chair, she practically disappeared. The aggressive, self-righteous church lady who had spent her entire life tearing me down was completely paralyzed. She knew exactly what this meant. If I had audited Terrence's books, I had seen the dummy loans he authorized for her husband. I had seen the corporate cash funneled into her private bank accounts to cover her own reckless spending. I owned her secrets too. I owned all of them. "You cannot do this to me," Terrence gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic high-pitched whine. "I am your brother Zora. We are family. You cannot just throw me out on the street like trash. I have a wife. I have a public reputation. You have to forgive the debt." Mom and Dad would have wanted you to forgive the debt and keep this family together. I stared at the man who had stolen my business plan, who had mocked my poverty, who had systematically drained my parents' empire, and who had just 10 minutes ago threatened to leave me homeless and bankrupted with a pathetic $10,000 settlement check. "Mom and Dad are the exact people who handed me the hammer, Terrence," I replied, my voice ringing clear and cold across the massive room. "They spent the last 2 months of their lives ensuring you would never touch another dime of their legacy. They stripped your power entirely. They gathered the hard evidence of your embezzlement. They handed it directly to federal investigators. You are not just facing a corporate foreclosure, Terrence. You are facing a massive federal indictment for corporate fraud and wire fraud." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat loudly, cutting through the absolute chaos unfolding around the table. He stood perfectly straight, smoothing his silver tie and looking directly at the digital display. "To finalize the legal transfer of the executorship and completely satisfy the probate court requirements, we must enter the verified solvency figure into the official record," Mr. Sterling announced, projecting his authoritative voice over Chloe's continued sobbing. "The court requires irrefutable proof that the executor possesses the personal capital to absorb and manage the massive liabilities attached to the estate." Sterling pressed his index finger against the tablet. The screen shifted one final time. It did not show corporate valuations or projected market shares. It showed a verified, audited, and legally bound statement of personal liquid assets, as confirmed by independent federal auditors and thoroughly verified by this law firm. Mr. Sterling read, his voice booming with undeniable finality. "Zora Williams possesses full liquid capital entirely independent of her corporate equity in Aura Ed. The total verified personal net worth of the executor is $150 million. The number hung in the air. $150 million. It was not tied up in restricted stock options. It was not locked in speculative commercial real estate or dummy corporations. It was verified liquid capital. It was absolute, undeniable power." Terrence stopped breathing. I watched his body physically shut down. The realization did not just hit him, it completely obliterated him. It hit him like a runaway freight train crashing through the fragile, desperate walls of his manufactured reality. His sister, the woman he had spent his entire life mocking, the woman he had called a failure, the woman he had just tried to buy off with $10,000, was worth $150 million. She did not just own the family house, she literally owned him. She owned his massive debts, his catastrophic failures, and his entire future. He was completely out of moves. The federal investigators were coming for him. The corporate bank accounts were frozen. The luxury cars would be repossessed by Friday. His entire identity as the golden child, the wealthy CEO, the untouchable heir, had just been violently ripped away and ground into fine dust right in front of his wife and his aunt. He was a beggar standing in my boardroom. Terrence's jaw slacked completely. The flushed, angry red color that had stained his cheeks instantly vanished, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray pallor. He looked like a corpse standing upright in an expensive tailored suit. His eyes wide and unblinking darted wildly around the room, searching for a way out, a legal loophole, a brilliant lie, a sudden rescue that was never going to come. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who offered him absolutely no sympathy. He looked at the heavy ivory will resting on the mahogany table, stripping him of his power. He looked at the glowing 80-inch screen broadcasting my immense wealth and his total ruin. Finally, he looked at me. He opened his mouth to speak. He tried to form a word, a desperate plea, a final insult, anything to prove he was still alive and still fighting. But his vocal cords completely failed him. All that escaped his lips was a soft, pathetic, rattling wheeze. A dark, arrogant laugh had escaped him just moments ago when he thought he had trapped me. Now he could not even pull a single breath of oxygen into his lungs. The sheer unadulterated terror of his impending federal bankruptcy, the total public humiliation, and the catastrophic loss of his entire false identity overloaded his nervous system entirely. Terrence's eyes rolled straight back in his head, showing only the stark, terrifying whites of his sclera. His body went entirely rigid for a fraction of a second, locking his muscles in pure shock. Then his knees violently buckled. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings completely severed. He dropped straight down, plunging out of sight behind the heavy mahogany table. His body hit the plush boardroom carpet with a massive, heavy thud that physically shook the crystal water glasses resting on the wood. The heavy thud of Terrence hitting the floor reverberated through the soles of my emerald heels. For a long, terrifying moment, the boardroom was plunged into an absolute deathly stillness. The massive 80-inch screen continued to cast its cool blue light over the room, illuminating the motionless form of my brother sprawled face down on the expensive woven carpet. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. The seasoned attorney simply reached forward and locked his tablet, securing the highly classified financial disclosures before taking a deliberate step back from the edge of the table. He folded his hands neatly in front of him, treating the unconscious man at his feet as nothing more than a minor logistical inconvenience. I looked down at the crumpled heap of charcoal gray suit fabric and polished leather shoes. Terrence had built his entire existence on the grand illusion of supreme control. Now his body had completely bypassed conscious thought, shutting down entirely, rather than facing the catastrophic consequences of his own actions. He could not handle the sheer magnitude of his defeat, so his brain simply turned the lights off. Then the spell broke. A sharp, frantic scraping sound echoed harshly across the glass walls of the executive suite. Chloe practically threw herself out of her plush leather chair. She scrambled backwards so fast her expensive designer heels tangled in the hem of her black morning dress. She hit the floor hard, her knees slamming violently into the carpet. But she did not reach for her husband. She did not lean over his prone body to check his pulse or elevate his head. She did not even look at his face. Instead, she crawled around his motionless legs, entirely focused on me. The transformation was staggering to witness. The venomous, arrogant country club queen, who had spent the last hour mocking my clothes, my finances, and my motherhood, was completely eradicated. In her place was a terrified, desperate animal cornered and fighting for survival. Her perfectly glossed lips were trembling uncontrollably. Her manicured hands clawed at the edge of the mahogany table as she dragged herself closer to where I stood. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, calculating greed. She recognized exactly where the absolute power in the room had shifted, and she immediately prepared to sacrifice her husband to save herself. "I did not know, Zora." Chloe gasped, her voice cracking into a shrill, panicked pitch that grated against the quiet room. "I swear to you on my life, I did not know anything about the debt." She grabbed the carved leg of the nearest chair, pulling herself up slightly so she could look me directly in the eye. The heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the overhead light, trembling violently as her hands shook. She was breathing so fast, I thought she might follow her husband into unconsciousness, but her self-preservation instincts were far too strong. "He lied to me," Chloe cried out, pointing a trembling finger down at Terrence's motionless form. "He told me the company was doing incredibly well. He told me the massive loans were just standard corporate restructuring. I had absolutely no idea he was leveraging the Buckhead estate or using the downtown commercial properties to cover his underground gambling markers. You have to believe me, Zora. I am a victim here too. He kept me completely in the dark. I stared down at her, watching her attempt to rewrite reality in real time. She was married to a man who had systematically stolen from our parents, who had plotted to leave me destitute, and the second the financial bill came due, she abandoned him on the floor without a single backward glance. "He is a monster," Chloe continued, her words tumbling out in a desperate, frantic rush. "He controlled all the bank accounts. He gave me a strict monthly allowance and punished me if I asked questions. I never saw the real corporate ledgers. Zora, you know I would never have supported this kind of theft. You know I always liked you. I always told Terrence he was being too hard on you. I told him he should have given you a senior position at the company. I was always on your side." The sheer audacity of her lie hung heavily in the air. I looked at the woman who had just 20 minutes ago called me a homeless single mother begging for relevance. She had gleefully detailed how the bank would foreclose on my house by Friday. She had sipped her expensive sparkling water and smiled a cruel, triumphant smile while predicting my absolute financial ruin. Now she was attempting to cast herself as my secret champion. "Zora, please," Chloe begged, thick black mascara tears finally spilling over her lashes and ruining her perfect makeup. "You cannot kick me out of the house. You cannot take the cars and the private accounts. What about my children? What about your niece and nephew? You cannot put them out on the street. They are innocent in all of this. They love their Aunt Zora. You cannot punish them for what their father did. He is a criminal, Zora. Send him to prison. Let the federal investigators take him away. I will testify against him in court. I will give the authorities whatever they want. Just please do not take my house. Please do not leave me with nothing." She was actually offering to serve her husband to the federal authorities on a silver platter in exchange for keeping her mansion and her luxury lifestyle. The sheer transactional nature of her loyalty was breathtaking in its coldness. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Chloe, turning my attention to the far corner of the massive table. Aunt Vivian remained absolutely frozen in her heavy leather chair. She had not moved a single muscle since Mr. Sterling announced my staggering net worth. Her hands were still clamped tightly over the armrests, her knuckles white with strain. The elaborate, expensive church hat she wore sat slightly askew on her head, but she did not dare reach up to fix it. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Aunt Vivian was a woman who traded strictly on family hierarchy and social currency. She had spent decades kissing the ring of whoever held the most power and wealth. For years, she had championed Terrence as the undisputed king of the Williams family, while treating me like an embarrassing stain on the family legacy. She had sneered at my freelance business, calling it a pathetic hobby. She had whispered to the entire church congregation about my supposed failures. She had actively participated in my humiliation today, nodding along enthusiastically, while Terrence outlined his malicious plan to leave me bankrupt. Now she realized she had backed the wrong horse. Worse, she realized she had actively alienated and insulted the true power in the family. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to. The heavy silence between us was sharper and more punishing than any insult I could hurl. I watched the horrific realization wash over her lined face. She knew about the dummy corporate loans. She knew about the company cash Terrence had illegally funneled into her private bank accounts to cover her extravagant church donations and personal shopping sprees. She knew that because I owned the debt, I also owned the ledgers. I had the power to expose her fraud to the entire community and strip her of her coveted social standing. Aunt Vivian swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. She tried to offer me a small, placating smile, a pathetic attempt to bridge the massive chasm she had created, but her facial muscles refused to cooperate. She simply shrank backward, pressing herself deeper into the leather chair, trying to become completely invisible. She knew her financial lifeline was entirely severed. She knew her reputation was about to be obliterated, and she knew she was absolutely powerless to stop it. The boardroom was suffocatingly quiet, save for the sound of Chloe's frantic hyperventilating on the floor. I looked back down at the kneeling woman. She was staring up at me with clasped hands, looking exactly like a desperate subject begging a monarch for mercy. She expected me to soften. She expected the strategic mention of her children to trigger some innate sense of familial duty and weakness. She expected me to play the role of the forgiving, submissive sister because that was the role they had forced me into my entire life. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no warmth. I felt only the cold, rigid certainty of a woman who had finally stepped into her true, unassailable power. I smoothed the front of my emerald suit jacket, ensuring every line was perfectly crisp and pristine. I did not break eye contact with Chloe as I took a deliberate, purposeful step forward. My foot passed directly over Terrence's unconscious form. I did not hesitate or stumble. I stepped over my brother as easily as one might step over a piece of discarded trash on the sidewalk. I stopped right in front of Chloe, looking down at her tear-stained face with absolute ice. "I believe you told me to take an Uber to a motel, Chloe." Chloe stared up at me with mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She could not comprehend the speed at which her luxurious reality was disintegrating. A few minutes ago, she was the untouchable wife of a corporate titan. Now she was kneeling on a boardroom carpet, begging the woman she had mercilessly tormented for a scrap of mercy. "Do not play the ignorant housewife with me, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "It is an insult to my intelligence, and it makes you look absolutely pathetic. You knew exactly where the money was coming from. You did not ask questions when Terrence bought you a $200,000 sports car for your anniversary. You did not bat an eye when you remodeled a kitchen that was already flawless. You gladly spent millions of dollars of stolen corporate capital to secure your position at the top of the social ladder. You are not a victim. You are a highly compensated accomplice." Chloe let out a loud, wretched sob. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my emerald suit skirt. I took a sharp step back, removing myself entirely from her reach. "Please, Zora," she wailed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "My babies, where will we go? We do not have anything else. You cannot put your own niece and nephew out on the street." "My niece and nephew will be well provided for," I stated smoothly. "Their educational trusts were secured by my parents before Terrence could drain them. They will not suffer because of their parents' greed. But you will not be living in a 10,000 square foot estate on my dime. You have exactly 1 hour to return to Buckhead and gather your personal clothing." I checked the sleek gold watch on my wrist. "My private security team is already waiting at the front gates of the estate," I continued. "They are highly trained professionals who do not respond to tears or bribery. They have been instructed to hand you a box of heavy-duty black hefty bags. You may fill those bags with your clothes and your children's clothes. You may not take the artwork. You may not take the jewelry Terrence bought you with embezzled funds. You may not take the furniture. When your 60 minutes are up, the security team will escort you off the property and the locks will be permanently changed. If you attempt to take anything that legally belongs to Apex Financial Acquisitions, I will have you arrested for theft before you even reach the end of the driveway." Chloe collapsed, completely burying her face in her hands and weeping hysterically onto the carpet. A low, guttural groan sounded from the floor. Terrence was finally beginning to regain consciousness. His fingers twitched against the carpet. He rolled slowly onto his side, his expensive charcoal suit now wrinkled and covered in fine dust from the floorboards. He blinked heavily, his eyes struggling to adjust to the bright overhead lights. For a brief, fleeting second, his face was blank. Then his eyes locked onto my shoes, and the memory of his absolute destruction crashed back down on him. He let out a sharp gasp, scrambling backward until his shoulders hit the base of the heavy mahogany table. He looked up at me like a trapped animal. He was sweating profusely and his chest heaved with panicked, uneven breaths. Mr. Sterling did not miss a beat. The imposing silver-haired attorney stepped forward smoothly, bypassing the weeping Chloe, and looking down at my brother with total professional detachment. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and retrieved a massive stack of thick legal documents bound by heavy rubber bands. "Terrence Williams." Mr. Sterling said, his deep voice cutting through Chloe's sobbing with surgical precision. "It is my legal obligation to formally serve you with these notices." Sterling dropped the massive stack of paper directly onto Terrence's lap. The sheer weight of the documents landed with a heavy smack against his thighs. Terrence flinched, staring down at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. The documents on top are formal notices of immediate foreclosure from Apex Financial Acquisitions, Mr. Sterling recited clearly. They cover your primary residence, your secondary vacation properties, and the commercial building housing your private investments. Your corporate bank accounts have already been frozen. Your personal credit lines have been entirely revoked. Terrence placed his trembling hands over his face, taking in ragged, desperate breaths. But Mr. Sterling was not finished. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a separate, sleek manila folder bearing the unmistakable blue seal of the federal government. He tossed it onto the carpet right next to Terrence's hand. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling continued, his tone devoid of any empathy. I am legally bound to inform you that the United States Department of Justice has formally processed the evidence provided by your late parents. That folder contains copies of your federal indictments. You are being officially charged with 34 counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and racketeering. Federal agents are currently securing your executive office downstairs. You will be expected to surrender yourself to federal marshals by tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Terrence let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a high-pitched, keening wail of absolute despair. He curled his knees into his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs, and rocking back and forth on the floor. The golden boy, the untouchable heir, the arrogant tyrant who had terrorized this family for decades, was reduced to a weeping, shattered mess hiding under a conference table. I stepped away from the wreckage of my brother and his wife. I turned my attention to the far end of the room where Aunt Vivian was still perfectly frozen in her oversized chair. She had watched the entire dismantling process in horrific silence. She had watched the brutal eviction of her favorite niece-in-law. She had watched her beloved golden nephew get served with federal prison indictments. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that her turn had arrived. As I locked eyes with her, Vivian swallowed visibly. Her throat bobbed and she forced her facial muscles to stretch into a wide, shaky smile. It was a ghastly expression devoid of any genuine warmth. Zora, sweetheart. Vivian stammered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. I am just so incredibly proud of you. I always knew you had a brilliant mind. You are just like your mother. We are family, Zora. Blood is blood. We have to stick together in times of crisis. Do not call me sweetheart Vivian, I commanded, my voice slicing through the air like a whip. And do not ever invoke my mother's name to save yourself. Her fake smile instantly vanished, leaving her face slack and terrified. You stood by and cheered while Terrence tried to destroy me, I said, taking a slow step toward her. You sat in that very chair and smiled when he offered me a pathetic $10,000 check. You have spent the last 15 years poisoning my name in your social circles, treating me like an embarrassment because I refused to participate in your shallow materialistic games. But worst of all, you actively participated in Terrence's fraud. Vivian shook her head violently, gripping her expensive pearl necklace. No, Zora. I swear I never touched the business. I do not know anything about the company accounts. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. You really think I do not have the receipts, Vivian? I asked, tilting my head and studying her panic. You think I did not see the massive regular transfers from the corporate discretionary fund directly into your personal checking account? You used stolen company money to fund your extravagant church donations so you could sit in the front pew and play the generous saint. You used embezzled capital to pay your luxury country club dues. You built your entire holier-than-thou reputation on money my brother stole from my parents. She opened her mouth to protest, but the absolute truth paralyzed her tongue. Your access to the family trust is permanently revoked, effectively immediately. I declared, rendering my final judgment. Your platinum black cards have been deactivated. I have already contacted the board of directors at your prestigious country club and provided them with the financial audit proving you paid your membership dues with stolen corporate funds. They have formally revoked your membership and permanently banned you from the premises. Vivian gasped, pressing a hand over her heart as if she had been physically shot. To her, losing her social standing was a fate worse than death. "You are completely excommunicated from this family circle, Vivian," I stated, staring her down until she lowered her eyes in absolute shame. "You are cut off. You will have to face your church friends and your socialite ladies as exactly what you are, a broke, hypocritical fraud who enabled a criminal." The boardroom was finally silent. The air felt entirely different. The oppressive, heavy toxicity that had poisoned this family for decades was completely eradicated, burned away by the harsh, brutal light of reality. Terrence was still rocking back and forth on the floor, clutching his federal indictments. Chloe was weeping silently into the carpet, ruining her expensive morning dress. Aunt Vivian sat completely motionless in her chair, staring blankly at the wall as she processed the total evaporation of her entire social identity. They were completely dismantled. I had stripped them of their wealth, their power, their fake reputations, and their arrogance. I had taken everything they valued and crushed it into dust. I stood tall at the head of the mahogany table. I reached down and methodically buttoned the front of my tailored emerald suit jacket. I smoothed the lapels, ensuring every line was perfectly pristine. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The massive, invisible weight of my family's expectations and cruelty was finally gone. I turned my head and looked at the imposing silver-haired attorney standing quietly by the digital console. "Thank you for your excellent work today, Mr. Sterling," I said, offering him a crisp, professional nod. "Please ensure the transition paperwork is filed with the probate court by the end of the business day." "It will be my absolute pleasure, Miss Williams," Mr. Sterling replied, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. I did not look back at my brother. I did not look back at his wife or my aunt. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. The sharp, authoritative click of my emerald heels echoed brightly against the polished floor. I pushed the glass doors open and walked out into the sunlit hallway, leaving my toxic family trapped in the boardroom to choke on the ashes of their own making. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swung open, but the energy inside the room was entirely transformed. The suffocating arrogance that once stained the walls had been completely scrubbed away. I sat behind the expansive glass desk overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Terrence had preferred a dark, oppressive aesthetic filled with heavy leather and thick cigar smoke. I had the entire floor gutted and flooded with natural light. In exactly 30 days, I had not merely stabilized the Williams corporate empire, I had completely resurrected it. The toxic $15 million debt was purged, absorbed effortlessly by Apex Financial Acquisitions. But the real work was excising the human rot my brother had left behind in the corporate hierarchy. Terrence had surrounded himself with a pathetic legion of sycophants, incompetent men who nodded at his terrible ideas and skimmed off the top of the operating budget. I fired every single one of them within my first 48 hours. I stood by the elevators and watched them carry their cardboard boxes out of the building, stripped of their unearned six-figure salaries and their fraudulent authority. In their place, I built a new vanguard. I promoted brilliant, marginalized women of color who had been deliberately passed over for decades. Women who had the actual education, the relentless drive, and the sharp instincts required to run a global operation. My new chief financial officer was a woman Terrence had kept trapped in middle management for 10 years because she refused to falsify his expense reports. My new head of acquisitions was a brilliant strategist he had previously fired for aggressively questioning his leverage scheme. The boardroom was no longer a toxic echo chamber of mediocre men. It was a war room of exceptional women who looked exactly like me, and they were already increasing our quarterly projections by double digits. While my empire expanded, Terrence was rapidly learning the harsh, brutal reality of the federal justice system. He was currently sitting in a stark concrete holding cell, facing 34 counts of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a plea deal. They seized his passport, they froze whatever hidden offshore accounts they could find, and they denied him bail due to the sheer magnitude of his financial crimes. The man who had mocked my cheap apartment and told me to take the bus was now wearing a standardized orange jumpsuit, eating terrible food and waiting for a trial that would undoubtedly lock him inside a federal penitentiary for decades. Chloe did exactly what I knew she would do. The second the federal agents raided their home, she turned on him completely. She filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and claiming she was an innocent, terrified victim of his financial deception. The judges and the federal creditors did not care about her tears. Every single asset purchased with stolen funds was aggressively liquidated. She was forcibly evicted from the massive Buckhead estate. She now lived in a cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment in a zip code she used to openly ridicule. Her elite social circle dropped her instantly. The country club women stopped answering her calls and blocked her number overnight. She spent her days trapped in a tiny kitchen listening to her neighbors through paper-thin walls entirely cut off from the unearned luxury she prized above all else. Aunt Vivian was officially a ghost. I had permanently severed her access to the family trust. Without the stolen corporate funds padding her bank accounts, she could no longer afford the exorbitant church donations that bought her front-row status. She lost her country club membership, and her manufactured social standing evaporated into thin air. The community she so desperately tried to impress quickly realized she was nothing more than a broke, hypocritical fraud who enabled a criminal. She sat alone in the back pew of her church, an excommunicated pariah ignored by the very people she used to rule over. I closed the final quarterly report on my desk and signed my name at the bottom with a smooth stroke of my pen. The corporate work for the week was officially finished. I packed my briefcase and took the private elevator down to my waiting car. The drive to the Buckhead estate was smooth and quiet. I rolled down the tinted window, letting the warm Georgia breeze wash over my face. The sprawling estate was finally exactly what it was meant to be, a sanctuary. The imposing wrought iron gates opened smoothly, recognizing my vehicle. I stepped out onto the manicured circular driveway, walking directly through the massive silent house and out onto the sprawling back patio. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the property. I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping down the crystal glass, and sank into a plush outdoor chair. Down on the manicured green lawn, Caleb was running happily. He was chasing a brightly colored soccer ball, his laughter ringing out clear and joyful across the estate. He looked so healthy and vibrant, completely untethered from the financial stress and the toxic family dynamics that used to govern our daily lives. He had his own massive bedroom, a private elite tutor, and a backyard that stretched on for acres. He was finally safe. He was secure. He would never know the desperate, grinding struggle I had endured. The heavy sliding glass door behind me opened quietly. Mr. Sterling stepped out onto the patio, holding his familiar battered leather briefcase. He walked over to the patio table and offered a highly respectful nod. The silver-haired attorney looked incredibly satisfied. The chaotic legal war of the past month had clearly invigorated him. "Good afternoon, Zora," Mr. Sterling said, his deep voice carrying a rare note of genuine warmth. "I apologize for intruding on your weekend, but I wanted to deliver these personally." He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked documents. He placed them gently on the glass table right next to my iced tea. "These are the finalized estate deeds," Mr. Sterling explained, resting his hand on the thick paper. "The probate court has officially closed the file. The $15 million debt has been entirely cleared and absorbed by Apex Financial Acquisitions. Every single asset, commercial property, and private account formerly belonging to your parents is now fully and legally transferred into your name alone. There are no remaining liens. There are no outstanding creditors. The transition is completely finished. You have absolute, uncontested ownership over the entire empire." I looked down at the deeds resting on the table. My name was printed clearly across the top line of every single page in bold black ink. I reached out and traced the heavy lettering with my index finger, feeling the physical weight of my victory. I looked back up at Mr. Sterling. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady and filled with absolute gratitude. "You navigated a minefield with absolute precision. I could not have secured this without your guidance." Mr. Sterling offered a rare, genuine smile. "It was my absolute honor, Zora," he replied. "Your parents built a formidable empire, but they lacked the necessary ruthlessness to protect it from the threats inside their own house. You possess the brilliance to expand it and the iron will to defend it. They would be exceptionally proud of the leader you have become. Enjoy your afternoon." He turned and walked back inside the house, leaving me alone with the warm breeze and the sound of my son laughing in the distance. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my iced tea, and looking out over the sprawling green acres of my new kingdom. The journey had been brutal. I had endured years of public humiliation, financial desperation, and calculated cruelty at the hands of the people who were supposed to protect me. They had labeled me the family failure. They had pushed me into the dirt and expected me to quietly fade away into pathetic obscurity. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of survival. Being treated as the outcast did not weaken me. It hardened me into something entirely unbreakable. I did not just survive being the black sheep of the Williams family. I quietly amassed the wealth, the knowledge, and the power to buy the entire pasture. I watched Caleb kick his soccer ball into the net, raising his small arms in absolute triumph. True legacy is never inherited through blind entitlement or aggressive arrogance. It is not handed down in a will or gifted through social status. True legacy is built through absolute resilience, relentless brilliance, and the ultimate unassailable power of sweet, calculated revenge. True power is not a birthright inherited from those who underestimate you. It is a fortress built from the bricks of resilience and strategic brilliance. By refusing to let toxic family members define your worth or control your narrative, you transform their cruelty into the fuel for your own independence. When you finally claim your space, you realize that the most satisfying revenge is not destruction. It is succeeding so completely that their opinions become irrelevant, proving that true legacy is not what is given, but what you have the courage to build for yourself.